Hello there everyone, welcome to Nightmare Narratives. I am your storyteller and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know many of you use these videos to drift off to sleep, so before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'm always curious, where are you watching from and what time is it in your part of the world? Now, find your cozy spot and relax. My name is Catherine Aldridge, and I need to tell you what really happened in the Tongass National Forest in 1971. I was 29 then, a forest ranger with 11 years of service under my belt. People called me the fire prevention expert. I knew every tree species in that massive Alaskan wilderness like they were old friends. Back then, I wore my engagement ring every single day. David wanted me to quit the ranger job after we got married in 6 months. "It's too dangerous," he'd say. "What if something happens to you out there?" I'd laugh it off, but deep down, I knew he was right to worry. I just didn't know how right he was. The Tongass is different from other forests. It's a temperate rainforest, which means it's always wet, always green, and always alive in ways that make your skin crawl if you pay attention. The trees grow so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Moss hangs from branches like old curtains. Everything drips constantly, even when it's not raining. I loved that forest more than anything. More than David, if I'm being honest. I'd spent my whole career protecting it from fires, from people who didn't understand how special it was. The old-growth trees there were hundreds of years old. Some were older than America itself. They deserved respect. That's why I didn't take the Tlingit elder's warnings seriously when he came to my office that cold November morning. His name was Thomas, and he spoke in broken English mixed with his native tongue. He was worried about the new logging operation that Cascade Timber had started up north. "They wake the Ottomen," he said, his weathered hands shaking as he pointed toward the forest. "Kushtaka sleep in old trees. You cut trees, you wake them up. They're not happy." I'd heard the Kushtaka stories before. According to Tlingit folklore, they were shapeshifters who could look like otters or humans. They were supposed to protect the forest and steal souls. Just old stories, I thought. The kind of tales people told around campfires to scare kids. "Thomas," I said gently, "those are just stories. The logging company has permits. They're only cutting in designated areas." His eyes got wide and scared. "You not understand. Trees scream when they cut. Trees bleed. Something wrong up there." I should have listened to him. God, I should have listened. Instead, I filed his report and forgot about it. I had real work to do. But 2 days later, I got a call from Jake Morrison, the site manager at Cascade Timber. His voice was shaky, not like his usual confident self. "Catherine, we need you up here. Something's wrong with the trees. The guys are spooked, and honestly, so am I." "What kind of wrong?" I asked, already reaching for my equipment bag. "When we cut them, they make sounds, like screaming, and the sap. It's red, dark red, like blood. I've been logging for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The weather was turning nasty as I drove up the mountain road to the logging site. November in Alaska means early snow and rain that cuts through your jacket like ice. The forest looked different somehow, darker and more twisted than usual. Even the familiar trees seemed to be watching me as I passed. I found Jake standing next to a massive cedar tree, freshly cut. He looked pale and tired, like he hadn't slept in days. The other loggers were standing around in small groups, talking in low voices and glancing at the tree stumps nervously. "Show me," I said. He led me to the stump. The wood was white and clean, like it should be, but thick, dark red sap was oozing from the cut, pooling on the ground like blood. I knelt down and touched it. It was warm and sticky, and it smelled wrong, not like pine sap at all, but like something organic and alive. "Has this happened before?" I asked. "Every tree we've cut in the last 3 days," Jake said. "And Catherine, I swear to God, when we run the chainsaws, it sounds like the trees are screaming." I stood up and looked around the clearing. 20 or 30 trees had been cut, and every stump was bleeding that dark red sap. The smell was getting stronger, making my stomach turn. "It's probably just a reaction to the cold weather," I said, trying to sound professional. "Sometimes sap changes color when the temperature drops suddenly." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. In 11 years of forest work, I'd never seen anything like this. I stayed at the logging camp that night to observe the site. Jake set me up in a trailer with a radio and some basic supplies. The plan was simple: document what was happening, take samples, and find a scientific explanation for the bleeding trees. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. Usually, the forest is full of sounds at night: owls hooting, small animals moving through the underbrush, wind in the branches. But this forest was dead silent, like all the animals had run away. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of chainsaws. That was weird because the logging crew didn't work night shifts. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed outside to investigate. The sound was coming from the main cutting area, but when I got there, I found something impossible. 3 chainsaws were running by themselves, cutting into trees with no one operating them. The blades moved back and forth like invisible hands were guiding them. I stood there for a full minute, watching the chainsaws work on their own. Then, suddenly, they all stopped at the same time. The silence that followed was so complete, it made my ears ring. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" No answer. I walked over to one of the chainsaws and picked it up. It was warm, like it had been running for hours. But there was no one around for miles except the sleeping logging crew. I radioed back to the trailer, but all I got was static. When I tried to start the chainsaw manually, it wouldn't turn over. None of them would. It was like they had been drained of power. As I walked back to the trailer, I noticed something else strange. The freshly cut trees from earlier in the day had moved. I'm not talking about settling or falling over. They had rotated, like someone had picked them up and turned them around. Some of the smaller logs were stacked in neat piles that definitely hadn't been there before. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the trailer, writing down everything I'd seen and trying to come up with rational explanations. Equipment malfunction, sleepwalking loggers, practical jokes, anything except the truth that was starting to form in the back of my mind. The next morning, Jake found me drinking my 4th cup of coffee and staring at pages of notes. "You look like hell," he said. "Did any of your crew work last night?" I asked. "No." "Why?" I told him about the chainsaws. He listened without saying anything, but I could see the fear growing in his eyes. "Catherine, I think we should shut down the operation," he said finally. "You can't do that. The company has contracts, deadlines. There's too much money involved. Money isn't worth this. Yesterday, we lost 3 chainsaws. Just lost them. The guys left them right here. And when they came back after lunch, they were gone. We found them this morning, buried 3 feet underground." I followed him to where they'd dug up the chainsaws. The holes were perfectly round, like the earth had opened up and swallowed the equipment, then closed again. There were no footprints, no signs of digging tools, just 3 chainsaw-shaped holes in the ground. "This is getting dangerous," Jake said. "I'm calling the company and requesting a shutdown until you figure out what's going on." That afternoon, I decided to do a thorough investigation of the cutting area. I brought sample containers, measuring tools, and my camera to document everything properly. If there was a scientific explanation for all this, I was going to find it. I started with the bleeding trees. The red sap was still flowing, but now it seemed thicker, more like actual blood. I collected samples from different stumps and noticed that the sap was warmest near the center of each cut, like it was coming from some internal source. As I worked, I became aware of a strange feeling, like I was being watched. I looked up from my sample containers and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Then I saw them, tracks in the mud near the largest stump. They were about the size of human feet, but webbed, like duck feet or otter feet. The tracks led from the stump into the forest, but they changed as they went. The first few prints were clearly animal, but as they got farther from the stump, they became more human-like. I followed the tracks for about 50 yards before they disappeared entirely. Right where they ended, I found something that made my blood run cold. Jimmy Walsh's hard hat and work gloves, covered in that same dark red sap. Jimmy was one of the loggers who had been working the day shift. I radioed back to camp. "Jake, where's Jimmy Walsh? He went home sick this morning. Said he felt like something was wrong with him." "What do you mean, wrong with him?" "He kept talking about dreams where he couldn't move, like he was stuck in something. And Catherine, his hands were all cut up, like he'd been clawing at tree bark all night." I stared at Jimmy's gear, lying there in the middle of nowhere. The sap on his gloves was still warm. That's when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost like a moan, but it grew louder and higher until it became a scream. Not a human scream, but not an animal either. Something in between. The sound was coming from the trees themselves. All around me, the forest was screaming. I ran back to camp as fast as I could, my equipment bag bouncing against my hip. The screaming followed me the whole way, getting louder and more desperate. By the time I reached the trailer, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the radio. "Jake, get everyone out of the forest. Now." "What's wrong?" "Just do it. Something's happening." But when Jake tried to round up his crew, we discovered that Jimmy Walsh wasn't the only one missing. 2 other loggers, Mike and Danny, hadn't been seen since the morning shift. Their equipment was still at the cutting site, but they were nowhere to be found. "They probably went back to town," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. I convinced Jake to let me bring in backup. Ranger Michael Kowalski was my closest friend in the service, and he'd dealt with strange situations before. He arrived that evening with a truck full of emergency equipment and a no-nonsense attitude. "So what are we dealing with?" he asked. "Bear attacks, unstable trees." I showed him the bleeding stumps, the mysterious tracks, and the missing equipment. Michael was skeptical at first, but when he saw the red sap flowing from the cuts, his expression changed. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "But there's got to be a logical explanation." We decided to do a night patrol together. If something was happening in the forest after dark, we needed to document it properly. Michael brought thermal imaging equipment and motion sensors. I brought my camera and sample containers. We set up our observation point near the main cutting area just as the sun was setting. The forest was already starting to feel different. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. Even the familiar sounds of wind in the trees seemed muffled and wrong. Around 10 p.m., the motion sensors started going off. We could see shapes moving through the thermal imaging, but they didn't look like any animals I knew. They were too big to be forest creatures, but they moved wrong for humans. They seemed to flow between the trees like liquid. "Are you getting this?" Michael whispered, adjusting the thermal camera. "Yeah, but I don't understand what I'm seeing." The shapes were gathering round the bleeding stumps. On the thermal display, they looked like they were kneeling or bowing, almost like they were praying. Then, one by one, they began to change form. The thermal signatures shifted from animal-like to human-like, then back again. "Michael, are you seeing this?" He didn't answer. When I looked over at him, he was staring at something behind me with pure terror in his eyes. I turned around slowly. Standing about 20 feet away was a creature that my mind couldn't process. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a body that seemed to shift between human and animal. Its hands were webbed, its eyes were too large and too dark, and its mouth was full of sharp teeth. But the worst part was that it looked intelligent. It was studying us like we were the strange ones. "Don't move," Michael whispered. The creature tilted its head, like it was listening to something we couldn't hear. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that was almost like words, but in a language I didn't recognize. More shapes moved in the darkness behind it. "We were surrounded. We need to get out of here," Michael said, slowly reaching for his radio. The creature's eyes fixed on the radio, and it made a sharp clicking sound. Suddenly, all our equipment went dead. The thermal imaging, the motion sensors, even our flashlights. We were alone in the dark with things that shouldn't exist. "Run," Michael said. We ran through the forest, crashing through underbrush and dodging branches. Behind us, I could hear the creatures following, but they didn't sound like they were in any hurry. They were herding us, I realized, driving us towards something. Michael was ahead of me when he suddenly stopped running. "Catherine, look at this." In a small clearing ahead of us, we found Mike and Danny, or what was left of them. They were still alive, but they had been partially merged with 2 large pine trees. Their bodies were embedded in the bark, arms and legs twisted into the wood. Their faces were still human, still conscious, and they were trying to speak. "Help, us, Mike managed to whisper. I started toward them, but Michael grabbed my arm. "Don't look at the trees." The trees were moving, breathing. The bark around the trapped men was pulsing like a heartbeat. Root systems were growing through their bodies, but somehow they were still alive, still aware. "What did this to you?" I asked. "Otter, men, Danny gasped. "They said, forest, angry, about, cutting." That's when I realized what was happening. The Kushtaka weren't just protecting the forest, they were making the humans part of it. turning them into living components of the ecosystem they'd damaged. A sound behind us made us turn. The creatures had caught up with us. There were dozens of them now, surrounding the clearing. In the moonlight, I could see them more clearly. They were shapeshifters, like the Tlingit stories said. Some looked more like otters, others more like humans, but all of them had those same intelligent, angry eyes. One of them stepped forward. It was the same one we'd seen earlier, but now it looked more human. It could have been a normal person, except for the webbed hands and the way it moved too smoothly, like it was swimming through the air. "You cut the old trees," it said in perfect English. "You hurt the forest. Now the forest takes back. We can stop the logging," I said. "We can protect the forest." Too late. The trees cry out in pain. We answer their call. The creature gestured. To the trapped men they stay. They become part of what they tried to destroy. But you, ... you have choice. What choice? Serve the forest. Protect the old growth. Stop the cutting forever. Or join your friends in the trees. I looked at Michael. He was staring at the creature men with a mixture of fear and fascination. What happens if we agree? You live. You go back to your people. You make sure no more trees are cut. You become guardians. And if we refuse, the creature smiled, showing those sharp teeth, you find out what it feels like to have roots growing through your body. Michael and I stood in that clearing, surrounded by shapeshifters and the conscious tree-merged remains of the loggers. The choice they'd given us was simple. Become guardians of the forest, or become part of it forever. "This is insane," Michael whispered to me. "We can't negotiate with whatever these things are." But I was starting to understand something that terrified me. The Kushtaka weren't evil. They were defending something ancient and sacred that we'd been destroying without thinking. Every tree we cut was hundreds of years old. Every stump that bled was a living thing that had been murdered. "How long have you been protecting this forest?" I asked the creature. "Since the first trees grew, since the ice went away. We are older than your people, older than your stories about us. But you've killed people before, only when they threatened the old growth. Your people used to understand. The Tlingit knew to ask permission, to take only what was needed. But the new people take everything." I looked at Mike and Danny, still conscious in their wooden prisons. "Can you free them?" "They cannot be freed. They are part of the forest now, but they are not in pain. They feel what the trees feel. They understand now why the forest must be protected." "This is murder," Michael said. The creature turned to him. "Is it murder when the forest fights back? When it defends itself against those who would kill it?" More Kushtaka emerged from the darkness. I counted at least 30 of them, all in various stages of transformation between otter and human. They formed a circle around us, but they didn't seem threatening now. They seemed sad. "We do not want to hurt you," the leader said, "but we will not let the cutting continue. Choose now." Michael pulled out his service weapon. "We're not choosing anything. We're getting out of here." The moment he drew the gun, the forest itself seemed to react. The ground beneath our feet began to move, roots pushing up through the soil. The trees around us started to lean inward, branches reaching toward us like grasping fingers. "Michael, don't," I shouted, but it was too late. He fired 3 shots at the creature leader. The bullets passed right through it like it was made of mist. The creature didn't even flinch, but the forest did. The roots erupted from the ground, wrapping around Michael's legs and arms. He screamed as they pulled him down, but he didn't disappear into the earth. Instead, a young cedar tree began to grow around him, its bark forming over his body like a second skin. In seconds, he was trapped just like the loggers, conscious but unable to move. His eyes were wide with terror as the tree continued to grow, incorporating him into its structure. "You chose," the creature said sadly. "He chose violence. Now he becomes part of what he tried to destroy." I fell to my knees, staring at Michael's face as it slowly disappeared behind the growing bark. "Please, let him go. I'll do whatever you want. It is too late for him, but not for you." The creature knelt beside me, and I could see that it was crying, actual tears running down its face. "We do not enjoy this," it said, "but the forest is dying. Your people cut the old trees faster than new ones can grow. Soon, there will be nothing left but stumps and bleeding earth." "I understand," I said, and I meant it. "I'll stop the logging. I'll protect the forest. You promise?" "I promise." The creature placed its webbed hand on my forehead. Suddenly, I could feel everything the forest felt. The pain of every cut tree, the slow death of the ecosystem, the desperate struggle of the remaining old growth to survive. I could hear the voices of trees that had been alive for centuries, crying out as they were reduced to lumber. But I could also feel something else. Hope. If the cutting stopped, if the forest was protected, it could heal. New trees could grow. The old ones could recover. You feel it now, the creature said. The forest's pain, will you remember? I'll remember. Then you may go. But if the cutting continues, if you break your promise, we will find you, and you will join your friends in the trees. The other Kushtaka began to fade back into the darkness, but the leader remained. Tell your people what you have seen. Tell them that the forest has guardians. Tell them that some things are too sacred to destroy. I looked one last time at Michael, at Mike and Danny, at the men who had become part of the forest they'd tried to cut down. They were still conscious, still aware, but they seemed peaceful now, like they finally understood. I'll tell them, I said. When I turned around, the creature was gone. I was alone in the clearing with the tree people, and the sound of wind in the branches. But now I could understand what the wind was saying. It was telling me to go, to keep my promise, to make sure this never happened again. I made it back to the logging camp just as the sun was rising. Jake was waiting for me, along with 2 state troopers who had come to investigate the missing men. Where's Michael? Jake asked. Where are Mike and Danny? I looked at these men, these representatives of the world that had sent me into the forest to manage and control it. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make them understand that the forest was alive, that it had guardians, that some things were too sacred to destroy? There was an accident, I said. They're gone. The official report listed Michael Kowalski, Mike Stevens, and Danny Rodriguez as missing, presumed dead. The logging operation was suspended pending investigation. I recommended that the entire area be designated as protected wilderness, off-limits to commercial development. The company fought the designation. Of course, there was too much money in those old-growth trees to just walk away, but strange things kept happening to anyone who tried to resume cutting. Equipment disappeared. Workers reported seeing figures in the forest that shouldn't have been there. Trees fell in impossible ways, always missing people by inches but destroying machinery. Eventually, Cascade Timber gave up. The area was designated as the Tongass Wilderness Preserve, protected by federal law. No cutting allowed, no development permitted. The forest would be left alone to heal. I quit the Forest Service a week after the incident. I couldn't go back to my old job, couldn't pretend that forests were just collections of trees to be managed and harvested. I broke my engagement to David. How could I marry someone who would never understand what I'd experienced? Instead, I became something else, an activist, a guardian. I spent the rest of my career fighting logging companies, protesting clear-cuts, chaining myself to trees that were scheduled for destruction. People called me an extremist, a radical. They had no idea how right they were, because I could still feel it. The connection the Kushtaka had given me. I could feel the pain of every tree that was cut, the slow death of forests around the world. And sometimes, in the deepest wilderness areas, I could sense the presence of the guardians, watching and waiting. I went back to the clearing once. About 10 years later, the trees that held Michael and the others had grown huge, their bark smooth and healthy. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd never guess that human beings were part of their structure. But I could still see their faces in the patterns of the bark, still hear their voices in the wind through the branches. They seemed happy. They had become part of something greater than themselves, something that would outlive civilization itself. In a way, I envied them. I'm telling you this story now because I'm old, and the cancer is winning, and I want someone to know the truth. The Kushtaka are still out there, still protecting the old forests. They're patient, but they're not infinite. Every year, more trees fall. Every year, the guardians grow angrier. The forest has its own justice system. It's older than human law, older than human morality. It doesn't care about jobs or profits or progress. It only cares about survival. And if we push it too far, if we take too much, the guardians will come for all of us. They'll make us part of what we've been destroying. They'll give us roots instead of legs, bark instead of skin, and we'll spend eternity feeling what we made the forest feel. Some nights, when the wind is right, I can still hear the trees talking. They're not just talking to each other anymore. They're talking to the guardians, telling them where the chainsaws are running, where the new cuts are being made. The forest is keeping score. And someday, it's going to collect what we owe. I kept my promise to the Kushtaka. I protected the forest until the day I couldn't anymore. Now it's someone else's turn, someone else's choice. Choose wisely. The trees are watching, the guardians are waiting, and they have very long memories. My name is Robert Kingsley, and I need to tell you about what happened in Mammoth Cave back in 1985. I was 42 then, a park ranger with 18 years under my belt. People called me the cave rescue guy because I knew every tunnel, every drop, every dangerous spot in those 400 miles of underground passages. I lived alone in a small cabin outside the park. My wife Susan had left me 2 years before, taking our daughter Emily with her. The divorce papers still sat on my kitchen table, reminding me that I owed $800 a month in alimony. On a ranger's salary, that money was hard to come by. I needed every hour of overtime I could get. That's why I volunteered for the night shifts. That's why I said yes when they asked me to check out the weird reports coming from the wild cave section. I should have said no. I should have listened to the warning signs. But I needed the money. The first strange report came in on a Tuesday morning. 3 experienced spelunkers had been exploring the deeper passages when they came running out, faces white as sheets. They kept talking about living shadows and darkness that moved wrong. The park supervisor, Jim Morrison, rolled his eyes and told them to file a report. Probably just bad air down there, Jim said to me later. You know how it is. People get spooked in the dark. I agreed. In 18 years of cave work, I'd seen plenty of scared tourists and amateur explorers. The caves played tricks on your mind. Shadows danced in flashlight beams. Echoes made normal sounds seem like monsters. Your brain started seeing things that weren't there. By Thursday, 2 more groups had reported similar experiences. They described shadows that moved without any light source, cold spots that appeared suddenly, and a feeling of being watched. One man swore he saw a shadow reach for him like a hand. The park management was getting worried. March was the start of tourist season, and word was spreading. Online forums were buzzing with talk of cave demons and shadow creatures. Visitor bookings were dropping. I need you to go down there, Jim told me on Friday evening. Do a full safety check. If there's bad air or unstable rock, we'll close that section. If it's just tourist nonsense, we'll put out a statement. I packed my gear that night. Rope, helmet, 3 flashlights, spare batteries, emergency radio, and a small tank of oxygen. I knew the wild cave section well. It was about 2 miles from the main tourist areas, accessible only to experienced cavers. The passages were narrow, with sudden drops and tight squeezes. My neighbor, old Pete Hawkins, stopped by as I loaded my truck. Pete had been caving in Kentucky for 40 years before he retired. Heard you're going into Wild Cave, he said, chewing on his tobacco. Be careful down there, Robert. Something ain't right. Just some spooked tourists, I replied. Nothing I can't handle. Pete shook his head. I've been in caves all my life. I know what normal fear looks like. This is different. The shadows, ... they move wrong. I laughed it off. Pete was getting old, and old cavers loved their ghost stories. But as I drove toward the park entrance that night, his words stuck with me. The parking area was empty, except for my truck. The March air was cold and damp, with storm clouds building overhead. I checked my equipment one more time, then headed for the Wild Cave entrance. The mouth of the cave looked like any other, a dark opening in the limestone hillside, surrounded by bare trees. But as I approached, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, a sense of being watched from the darkness. I turned on my helmet light and stepped inside. The first 100 yards were familiar territory. I'd been through this passage dozens of times. The walls were smooth, limestone, carved by water over millions of years. My footsteps echoed ahead of me into the darkness, but something felt different. The air was too still, too quiet. Even my breathing seemed too loud. At the first junction, I stopped to check my map. The spelunkers had reported their encounters about half a mile deeper, in a section called the Cathedral Room. I'd been there before. It was a large chamber with a high ceiling, named for the way voices echoed like church bells. As I folded my map, my flashlight beam caught something on the wall. Scratch marks, deep grooves in the stone, like claw marks, but they were fresh, cutting through the mineral deposits that took centuries to form. I bent down for a closer look. The marks were impossibly deep, gouged into solid rock. No animal could have made them. No tool either, unless someone had brought a diamond-tipped drill down here. A cold draft touched the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me except the passage I'd just walked through. The air was still again. I kept walking, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. My flashlight beam seemed weaker now, barely pushing back the darkness. I checked the batteries. They were fresh, but the light was definitely dimming. That's when I saw my first shadow move. It was subtle at first, just a dark shape that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I stopped and aimed my flashlight at the spot. Nothing there, just smooth stone wall. But when I moved the light away, the shadow moved again. This time I was sure of it. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed down the passage. "Is someone there?" No answer, but the shadow on the wall seemed to grow larger. I told myself it was just my imagination, poor air quality, maybe, or stress from the divorce. But my hands were shaking as I continued. Deeper into the cave, the passage narrowed, then opened into a wider chamber. This was where the real strangeness began. The cathedral room was different than I remembered. The space felt smaller, more cramped. The ceiling seemed lower, pressing down like a weight. And it was cold, so cold I could see my breath. I set up my equipment in the center of the chamber and began a methodical search. I tested the air quality with a small meter, normal oxygen levels, no dangerous gases. I checked the rock formations for signs of instability. Everything looked solid. My radio crackled with static, but picked up the base station clearly. There was nothing wrong with this cave, nothing that would explain the reports, but the shadows were definitely moving. I first noticed it when I was checking the far wall. My flashlight beam would illuminate an area, and when I moved it away, the darkness seemed to flow like water. Not instantly, but slowly, like thick liquid pouring down the wall. I tried to track the movement with my light, but whenever I shone it directly on a shadow, it became normal again, still and motionless, the way shadows should be. "This is Robert," I said into my radio. "I'm in the cathedral room. No safety. Issues found. Air quality is normal." Static answered me. Then Jim's voice. "Copy that, Robert. Any sign of what's been spooking the tourists?" I looked around the chamber. The shadows seemed to be watching me, waiting. Nothing concrete. "I'll do a full sweep and head back." "Roger. Check in every 30 minutes. I clipped the radio back to my belt and continued my search. That's when I found the first piece of equipment. It was a helmet, sitting upright in a corner of the chamber. Not old and forgotten, but recent. The battery pack was still warm to the touch. I recognized the brand expensive gear, the kind serious cavers used. There was no sign of its owner. I picked up the helmet and examined it. No damage, no blood. It looked like someone had just set it down and walked away. But nobody walks away from their only light source in a cave. "Jim," I said into the radio, "I found some abandoned equipment. Looks recent, static." "Then what kind of equipment?" "Helmet and light. Still has power." I looked around the chamber again. No sign of the owner. Could be from earlier this week. "We'll check if anyone reported missing gear." I was about to respond when I heard something. A sound like fabric, rustling, or wings flapping. It came from the passage I'd entered through. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, but the passage was empty. Still, I had the distinct feeling that something had just moved out of sight. "I'm going to check the connecting passages," I told Jim. "There might be someone else down here. Be careful, Robert. Don't go alone if you think someone's lost." Too late for that advice. I was already moving toward the sound, my light cutting through the darkness ahead of me. The passage split into two branches. I chose the left one, following a path I'd explored before, but after 50 yards, I stopped. This wasn't right. The passage was leading upward, but I remembered it going down. The walls were different to rougher, with formations I didn't recognize. It was like I was in a completely different cave. I backtracked to the split and tried the other branch. Same problem. The familiar passages had become strange, leading in directions that didn't match my memory or my map. That's when I heard the scream. It came from behind me, echoing through the cathedral room. A woman's voice, high and terrified. Then it cut off abruptly. I ran back toward the main chamber, my light bouncing wildly off the walls. "Hello, are you hurt? Where are you?" No answer. But when I reached the cathedral room, I wasn't alone anymore. Ranger Diana Walsh was standing in the center of the chamber, her back to me. She was young, maybe 25, with short brown hair and a compact build. I'd worked with her a few times on rescue calls. "Diana," I called out. "What are you doing here?" She didn't turn round. She was staring at something on the far wall, her posture rigid with fear. "Diana, can you hear me?" Finally, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Robert," she whispered, "look at the wall." I aimed my flashlight where she was pointing. At first I saw nothing unusual, just a limestone wall of the chamber, with the usual mineral deposits and rock formations. Then I saw it. There was a shadow on the wall, a human-shaped shadow, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with fingers that stretched like claws, and a head that seemed to shift and flow. The shadow was moving, even though there was no one casting it. "How long have you been watching it?" I asked. "Since I got here," Diana said. "Maybe 10 minutes. It keeps getting bigger." She was right. The shadow was growing, spreading across the wall like spilled ink. And as it grew, the temperature in the chamber dropped. I could see Diana's breath now, white puffs in the beam of my flashlight. "We need to get out of here," I said. But when I turned toward the passage, the shadow was there too, on the wall beside the entrance, blocking our way out. Not physically blocking it, it was just a shadow, after all, but the sight of it made me freeze. The shadow moved again, this time reaching toward us. The dark fingers stretched across the wall, growing longer and longer until they were only feet away from where we stood. "Run," Diana whispered. We ran, but the passages had changed again. What should have been a straight shot to the entrance had become a maze of unfamiliar tunnels. My light seemed weaker now, barely penetrating the darkness ahead of us. Behind us, I could hear something following, not footsteps, but a sound like wind through leaves, or whispers in a language I didn't understand. "This way," Diana said, pulling me toward a narrow passage on the right. We squeezed through the opening and found ourselves in a small chamber I'd never seen before. The walls were covered in strange markings, not natural formations, but deliberate scratches and symbols, old ones, worn smooth by time. "We're lost," Diana said, her voice shaking. "These passages, they're not on any map." I tried the radio. Static. We were too deep, or something was interfering with the signal. That's when Diana screamed again. I spun around to see her backing away from the wall, her hands held up defensively. The shadow was there, right beside her. But this time, it wasn't just on the wall. It was reaching off the wall, stretching toward her like a three-dimensional thing. Dark fingers that moved through the air, grasping for her face. "Get away from it," I shouted. But Diana seemed frozen. The shadow touched her cheek, and she aged 10 years in an instant. Her hair turned gray. Lines appeared around her eyes, and her face became gaunt and hollow. Then the shadow pulled back, and Diana collapsed. I ran to her side, but she was unconscious. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak, and she looked old. Not 25 anymore, but 45, maybe 50. When I looked up, the shadow was gone. The wall was normal again, just limestone and mineral deposits. But Diana was dying, and I had no idea how to save her. I carried Diana through the passages, searching for a way out. But the cave had become a labyrinth, with passages that led nowhere and chambers that defied the laws of physics. Some rooms had no ceiling I could see. Others had multiple floors that somehow occupied the same space. My flashlight was dying, despite the fresh batteries I'd put in less than an hour ago. The beam was getting weaker and more yellow, like an old bulb burning out. After what felt like hours of searching, I found a small alcove with a natural shelf. I laid Diana down as gently as I could and checked her pulse. Still alive, but barely. Her breathing was so shallow, I had to put my ear to her chest to hear it. Her hair was completely white now, and her face was covered in deep wrinkles. She looked like an old woman, not the young ranger I'd known. I tried the radio again. Nothing but static. "Diana," I whispered. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with cataracts, like an elderly person's eyes. "Robert," her voice was weak and raspy. "I'm here. What happened to you?" It had touched me. She struggled to sit up. The shadow, it was cold, so cold, and I felt my life being pulled away. "Just rest. I'll find us a way out." She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "No, listen to me. It's not just a shadow. It's something else. Something that doesn't belong in our world." "What do you mean?" The markings on the walls, they're not random, they're warnings. This has happened before, Robert, many times. I looked around the alcove. She was right, there were symbols carved into the stone. Not Native American petroglyphs, but something older. Something that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. How do you know this? When it touched me, I saw things, images. This cave system connects to somewhere else, a place where the shadows are alive, and they're hungry. The sound echoed through the passage outside our hiding place. That same rustling, whispering noise I'd heard before, but louder now, and closer. It's coming back, Diana whispered. I helped her to her feet, and we continued through the maze of passages. But Diana was moving slowly, like her aged body couldn't keep up with her mind. Every few steps, she had to stop and rest. The whispering sound followed us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. It was like being stalked by something invisible. We reached another chamber, this one larger than the cathedral room. The ceiling stretched up into darkness beyond my flashlight beam, and covering the walls were more symbols, thousands of them, carved deep into the stone. My God, Diana breathed. How old are these? Some of the symbols looked familiar, like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Others were completely alien, geometric, shapes that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the chamber was a deep pit. I couldn't see the bottom, even with my flashlight, but I could feel air moving up from below, carrying with it the smell of decay and something else, something that made my skin crawl. We need to get out of here, I said, but the passages leading away from the chamber were blocked now, not by cave-ins or fallen rocks, but by shadow. Solid, impenetrable darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. We were trapped. The whispering grew louder, coming from all directions at once. And then I saw it, the shadow creature, emerging from the pit in the center of the chamber. It wasn't just a shadow on the wall anymore. It was three-dimensional, massive, with tentacle-like appendages that writhed and grasped at the air. Its core was a deep, pulsing red, like a malevolent heart. Diana screamed and collapsed. The sight of the creature was too much for her aged body. She was breathing but unconscious, her pulse growing weaker. The creature turned its attention to me. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt its gaze like ice water in my veins. It began to move closer, its tentacles reaching toward me. I aimed my flashlight at it, and the beam seemed to cause it pain. The creature recoiled, its form becoming less solid, but my light was almost gone now, barely more than a dim glow. I reached into my pack and pulled out my emergency flare. The bright phosphorus light filled the chamber, and the creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal that made my teeth ache. But the flare wouldn't last long, and when it died, the creature would be back. I had to find another way out. In the flare's light, I could see the symbols on the walls more clearly. They weren't random after all. They formed a pattern, a map of sorts, and one section showed what looked like a way out, a passage that led up and away from the pit. I scooped up Diana in my arms and ran toward the passage marked on the wall. The creature followed, its tentacles reaching for me, but the flare kept it at bay. The passage was narrow and steep, climbing upward through the rock. Diana was barely breathing now, her body impossibly frail. I could feel her life slipping away with each step. Behind us, the creature's shrieks grew louder, more desperate. It was following us up the passage, but the narrow space seemed to constrain it somehow. We reached another chamber, smaller than the last, but there was something different about this one. The air was warmer, and I could smell something familiar. Pine trees and fresh earth. Surface smells. On the far wall was an opening, and through it I could see stars. An exit. I stumbled toward it, Diana's unconscious form in my arms. But as I reached the opening, the shadow creature burst into the chamber behind us. It was massive now, filling the entire space. Its tentacles reached for me, and I felt the same cold that had aged Diana. My hair began to turn gray, and my muscles weakened. But I was close to the exit. So close. With the last of my strength, I threw myself through the opening, Diana still in my arms. We tumbled out into the night air, rolling down a steep hillside covered in dead leaves. Above us, the cave entrance erupted with an inhuman shriek, but the creature didn't follow. It couldn't leave its domain. We were free, but Diana was dying, and I had aged 15 years in a single night. The hospital couldn't explain what had happened to Diana. The doctors said she showed signs of rapid aging, cellular breakdown, organ failure, everything they'd expect to see in someone 3 times her actual age. But medically, It was impossible. She lived for 3 days, drifting in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she kept talking about the symbols on the cave walls and the place between worlds. The doctors thought it was delirium, but I knew better. On the 3rd day, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Robert," she whispered, "I figured it out. The symbols, they're not just warnings, they're instructions." Instructions? For what? How to seal it? How to keep it from coming through? She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. I drew them from memory. "The closing ritual. You have to go back." "No," I said firmly. "I'm not going back down there. You have to. It's getting stronger. Every time it feeds, it grows. Soon it won't need the cave anymore. It'll be able to reach the surface." Diana died that night. The official cause was listed as sudden onset aging syndrome, a condition that didn't exist in any medical textbook. I went to her funeral 3 days later. Her parents were there, confused and heartbroken. They kept asking me what had happened to their daughter, why she looked so old, why she died so young. I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe it? But I kept thinking about her final words. The creature was getting stronger, and if she was right, it wouldn't stay underground forever. I unfolded the paper she'd given me. The symbols were perfectly drawn, despite her aged and shaking hands. They showed a ritual, a way to close the portal between worlds, but it required going back into the cave. I spent a week trying to convince myself that Diana had been delirious, that the creature was just a hallucination brought on by bad air or stress, but the evidence was too strong. I had aged 15 years in a single night. Diana had died of impossible causes, and the scratches on the cave walls were real. More reports were coming in. Hikers near the cave entrance were reporting strange feelings and moving shadows. A search and rescue team had found the bodies of 3 spelunkers in a passage that officially didn't exist. They were mummified, drained of all moisture, looking like they'd been dead for decades. The creature was still feeding. I couldn't let it continue. I had to go back. I prepared more carefully this time. Military-grade flashlights, multiple backup batteries, emergency flares, and a small tank of compressed air. I also brought something else, a camera, to document what I found. The cave entrance looked different in daylight. The shadows seemed deeper, more solid, and the air coming out of the cave was ice cold, even though it was a warm April day. I left a note in my truck, explaining what I was doing and why. If I didn't come back, at least someone would know the truth. The passages were wrong again, leading in directions that didn't match my memory or any map. But this time, I had Diana's drawings to guide me. The symbols on the walls formed a path, leading deeper into the cave system. I found the cathedral room, but it was different now, bigger, with passages leading off in all directions, and the walls were covered in fresh symbols, carved deep into the stone. The creature had been busy. I followed the symbol path deeper, into passages I'd never seen before. The air grew colder with each step, and my flashlight beam seemed to bend and twist, like light passing through water. Finally, I reached the chamber Diana had described. The pit was still there, but it was larger now, maybe 50 feet across, and from its depths came a sound like thousands of voices whispering in unison. The creature was down there, waiting. I set up my equipment around the pit, following the pattern Diana had drawn. Emergency flares in a circle, batteries and backup lights at specific points. It looked like some kind of occult ritual, but I trusted her research. When everything was ready, I called out to the creature. "I know you can hear me," I said. "I know you understand." The whispering stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. Then it began to emerge from the pit, massive, writhing, with that pulsing red core that seemed to look right through me. It was bigger than before, fed by the lives it had stolen. "You don't belong here," I said, my voice shaking. "Go back to wherever you came from." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of everyone it had killed. "This world is so full of life," it said in Diana's voice, "so full of energy to consume. Why would I leave? Because I'm going to make you." I lit the first flare and threw it into the pit. The creature shrieked and recoiled, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began to change, becoming more solid, more real. "You cannot stop me," it said, now using the voice of one of the dead spelunkers. "I am growing stronger. Soon, I will not need this cave. I will walk your world freely." I lit the second flare. The creature lunged at me, its tentacles reaching for my face. I felt that terrible cold again, felt my life being drawn away. But I held on to the flare, keeping it between us. The creature's form began to waver, becoming less solid. The intense light was weakening it somehow. The light, I realized. You can't handle real light. I lit all the remaining flares at once, creating a blazing circle around the pit. The creature screamed and began to retreat, its form becoming more and more translucent. But it wasn't enough. The flares would burn out in minutes, and then it would be back. I looked at Diana's drawings again. There was more to the ritual, symbols that had to be carved into the rock while the creature was weakened. I pulled out a knife and began carving the symbols into the stone floor around the pit. The creature fought back, sending waves of cold and despair that made my hands shake. But I kept working, following Diana's precise instructions. With each symbol I completed, the creature grew weaker. Its form began to fade, becoming more and more transparent. "You cannot banish me," it said, its voice now just a whisper. "I am eternal. I am the darkness between worlds." I carved the final symbol just as the flares began to die. The creature made one last desperate lunge, but it was too late. The ritual was complete. The pit began to collapse, the stone walls folding in on themselves. The creature shrieked one final time, then was pulled back into whatever dimension it had come from. The passage that had led to this chamber sealed itself, the walls flowing together like liquid stone. The symbols I had carved glowed briefly, then faded to normal rock. It was over. I made it out of the cave just as the sun was rising. The Park Service found me collapsed near the entrance, babbling about shadows and creatures. They said I'd been missing for 3 days, though it felt like only hours to me. The official report blamed the incident on a gas leak in the cave system. The wild cave section was permanently sealed, with concrete barriers and warning signs. The public was told that geological instability made the area too dangerous for exploration. They transferred me to a different park, far from Kentucky. I took early retirement a year later, claiming health problems. That wasn't entirely a lie. I'd aged 15 years in a single night, and my hair had turned completely grey. But the real reason I left was the dreams. Every night, I saw that creature in the pit, heard its voice using the words of the dead. And sometimes, in the early morning darkness, I'd see shadows moving wrong in the corner of my eye. I moved to Arizona, where the sun shines almost every day. I keep bright lights on in my house, from sunset to sunrise. I've developed a fear of enclosed spaces, of anywhere the shadows might gather. The nightmares have faded over the years, but they haven't stopped. And sometimes, I hear reports that make me wonder if the ritual really worked. A coal mine in West Virginia, where miners reported living shadows. A subway tunnel in New York, where maintenance workers disappeared. A cave system in New Mexico, where spelunkers found symbols carved into the walls. The creature called itself the darkness between worlds. Maybe there's more than one. Maybe they're everywhere, waiting, in the places where light doesn't reach. I still have Diana's drawings, locked in a safe deposit box. I've made copies and sent them to people who might believe paranormal researchers, cave rescue teams, anyone who might encounter what we faced. Most of them think I'm crazy. That's fine. I'd rather be thought crazy than have someone else go through what Diana and I experienced. But if you ever find yourself in a cave and the shadows start moving wrong, if you feel something watching you from the darkness, remember this story. Get out, get to the light, and whatever you do, don't let it touch you, because some darkness is alive, and it's always hungry. I'm 73 now, though I look closer to 90. The creature took years from my life that I'll never get back, but I'm still here, still watching, still warning anyone who will listen. The wild cave section of Mammoth Cave remains sealed. The Park Service lists it as a geological hazard, and most people accept that explanation. But I know the truth, that darkness between worlds is real. And somewhere, in the deepest places where light never reaches, it's waiting for someone to break the seals and let it through. Don't let that someone be you. My name is Robert Kingsley, and this is my warning. The darkness is patient. It can wait forever, but it never stops being hungry. My name is Thomas Redstone, and I've been a park ranger at Yellowstone for 20 years. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what really happened in September of 1962. The newspapers called it a rogue bear attack. But that's not what I saw. That's not what killed 3 good men. I was 45 then, married to Sarah for 18 years. We had 2 boys, Jimmy was 16 and Billy was 14. Both smart kids, both college-bound. If we could scrape together the money. Sarah had been fighting cancer for 2 years. The treatments were expensive, and my ranger salary didn't stretch far enough. I needed this job. I needed every dollar. People think being a park ranger is easy work, just driving around looking at pretty mountains. They don't know about the 2 million acres we patrol, the bears that can crush a man's skull with one swipe, the tourists who think they can pet a bison. In 20 years, I'd handled 89 bear encounters. I knew their sounds, their tracks, their moods. I'd fought in Korea before this job, so I wasn't easily scared. Bears were just big animals. Dangerous, yes, but predictable. That September, morning started like any other. I was drinking coffee in the station when Jake Miller called. Jake owned cattle land right next to the park boundary. He was upset, talking fast. "Tom, you need to get over here. Something killed 3 of my steers last night, but it wasn't normal. This thing, it arranged them. Arranged them, how? Come see for yourself, and bring your big gun." I drove my truck to Jake's ranch, about 30 minutes from the main road. The morning air was crisp, full of pine and wood smoke. The mountains stood tall and quiet around us. Beautiful country, but harsh. Things died here all the time. That was just nature. Jake met me at his gate. He was a tough man, ran cattle for 30 years, but his hands were shaking when he lit his cigarette. "Over here," he said, leading me to a clearing near the tree line. What I saw stopped me cold. 3 steers lay in a perfect triangle, not scattered like a normal predator kill, but positioned. Their wounds were clean, surgical. Long claw marks ran along their sides, but the cuts were too neat, too purposeful. Around each animal, someone had arranged rocks in small circles. "You ever see anything like this?" Jake asked. I knelt beside the nearest steer. The claw marks were huge, bigger than any grizzly I'd ever tracked. But it was the placement that bothered me. No bear arranges its kills. No bear makes patterns. With rocks, probably just a big grizzly, I said. But the words felt wrong in my mouth. Maybe something spooked it before it could eat. Jake shook his head. "Tom, I grew up here. My daddy ran cattle here before me. This ain't no bear." I found tracks leading away from the kill site. They started as bear prints, massive paws, long claw marks in the dirt. But 20 yards away, they changed. The paws became feet. Human feet, but bigger than any man's. Stride was too long, the impression too deep. "What do you make of this?" I asked Jake. He looked at the tracks and went pale. "My grandmother told stories about things like this. Crow legends, but those are just ... Just what?" "Just stories," he whispered. I took photos, made notes, collected measurements. Everything had to be documented. The Park Service demanded paperwork for every incident, but as I worked, I felt watched. The forest around us was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no sounds except our breathing. On the drive back, I stopped at the crow reservation. Old Billy Crowhorn sat on his porch, carving a piece of wood. He'd been there longer than anyone could remember. People said he knew things about the old days, before the park, before the ranchers. "Morning, Billy," I said. He looked up with cloudy eyes. "Morning, Ranger. You look worried. Found some dead cattle. Strange kill pattern. Wanted to ask if you'd heard anything." Billy's knife stopped moving. "Where Jake Miller's place?" "Near Broken Horn Creek." The old man set down his carving and stared at me. "You need to stay away from there." "Why?" "That's a bad place. Sacred place. There's an old warrior trapped there. He walks between the bear and the man. Sometimes he gets angry." I'd heard these stories before. Local folklore, nothing more. "Billy, I appreciate the warning, but I need to find whatever killed those cattle." "Some things shouldn't be found," he said quietly. "Some things should be left alone." I drove back to the station as the sun was setting. The mountains looked different somehow, darker. I filed my report, called it a large predator incident, recommended increased patrols. Just another day in the park. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those tracks, how they changed from bear to human, how the rocks were arranged in perfect circles, how the forest had been too quiet. Sarah rolled over in bed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, honey. Just work stuff." "You're worried about money again." I was. The medical bills kept coming. The boys needed school clothes. Winter was coming, and the house needed repairs. I couldn't afford to lose this job over some crazy talk about bear men. It's fine, I said. Just a problem bear. I'll handle it. But as I lay there in the dark, I heard Billy Crowhorn's voice in my head. Some things shouldn't be found. The next morning brought bad news. Jake Miller was dead. Sheriff Hayes called me at 6 a.m. Tom, you need to get to the Miller place. Bring your camera. I drove fast, my hands tight on the steering wheel. The morning felt wrong. Too cold, too quiet. Even the birds seemed nervous, flying in quick, jerky patterns. Sheriff Hayes met me at Jake's house. He was a good man, dealt with everything from drunk tourists to bar fights, but he looked shaken. Found him in the barn, Hayes said. It's bad, Tom. Jake lay on the straw floor, his body torn open by massive claws. But this wasn't a normal mauling. The wounds were too clean, too precise. And Jake had been arranged like the cattle, arms spread wide, legs straight, surrounded by small rocks in perfect circles. Jesus, I whispered. There's more, Hayes said. He led me to the barn wall. Carved into the wood were symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters, but shapes that looked almost like pictures. A bear, a man, a mountain. You ever see anything like this? Hayes asked. I shook my head, but something about the symbols felt familiar. Old, important. We found tracks leading away from the barn. The same pattern as before. Bear prints that became human feet. But these tracks were clearer, deeper. Whatever made them was getting bolder. We need to call in the state police, Hayes said. Maybe the FBI. And tell them that a bear that turns into a man is killing people. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. So what do? We find it and stop it. That afternoon, I gathered my gear, tranquilizer rifle, tracking equipment, emergency radio. Paul Henderson, another ranger, volunteered to help. Paul was young, maybe 25, but he was good in the woods. You really think it's just a bear? Paul asked as we loaded the truck. Has to be, I said. Bears can stand upright. In poor light, they might look human. People see what they want to see. But I didn't believe my own words anymore. We drove to the area where the tracks disappeared, near a thermal field called Devil's Kitchen. The ground was warm here, heated by underground springs. Steam rose from cracks in the earth, and the air smelled of sulfur. Why would a bear come here? Paul asked. Water, I said. Or maybe it's sick. Rabid animals sometimes seek out heat. We followed the tracks into the thermal field. The ground was soft, muddy, perfect for tracking. But something was wrong with the prints. They were too perfect, too evenly spaced, like something was trying to leave a trail. Tom, Paul said quietly. We're being followed. I stopped and listened. Behind us, maybe 50 yards back, something was moving through the brush, not trying to hide, just ... following. Bear, Paul whispered. I nodded, but my skin was crawling. This didn't feel like a bear. This felt like something that wanted us to know it was there. We kept walking. The thing behind us kept pace, never getting closer, never falling behind, just ... following. Then Paul screamed. I spun around and saw him on the ground. Above him stood the biggest bear I'd ever seen, 9 feet tall, massive shoulders, but its eyes were wrong. They were too smart, too aware. They looked human. The bear's front paws weren't quite paws anymore. They were hands, with long black claws and opposable thumbs. It looked at me, and I swear it smiled. I raised my rifle, but the bear was already moving. It grabbed Paul with those horrible hands and lifted him like he weighed nothing. Paul screamed again, then went silent as the claws found his throat. But the bear didn't kill him. It threw him aside, gently, like it was being careful. Then it looked at me again and spoke. Leave, it said in a voice like grinding stone. This place is sacred. I fired the tranquilizer dart. It hit the bear in the chest, but the animal just looked down at it like it was mildly annoying. Then it pulled the dart out and dropped it. Leave, it said again, or join the others. Then it was gone, moving through the thermal field faster than anything that big should move. The whole encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. I ran to Paul. He was alive but badly hurt. 3 long gashes ran across his chest, and his shoulder was dislocated. But he was conscious, staring at me with wild eyes. Tom, he whispered. It talked to me. Before you got here, it talked to me. What did it say? It said ... It said it was sorry, that it didn't want to hurt me, but it had to. Protect the sacred places. And Tom ... What? It spoke in Crow, perfect Crow, like it was born to it. I got Paul to the hospital, told the doctors it was a bear attack. They believed me, the wounds looked right, and bear attacks happened, sometimes, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Paul had said. It spoke in Crow. That night, I went back to see Billy Crowhorn. He was still on his porch, but now he was just sitting, not carving, like he was waiting for me. "You saw it," he said before I could speak. "I saw a bear, a big one." "No," Billy said. "You saw him, the warrior." "Billy, I need to know what's really happening here." The old man was quiet for a long time. Then, he said, "Long time ago, there was a Crow warrior named Broken Horn. He was proud, strong, but he made a mistake. He betrayed his people, sold sacred land to white men for money. The elders cursed him, trapped him between the bear and the man. He can't die, can't live, can't rest. He guards the sacred places now, but the curse makes him angry, makes him hungry." "That's just a story, is it?" Billy asked. "How many more people have to die before you believe?" I went home that night and held Sarah while she slept. Her breathing was shallow, weak. The cancer was getting worse. We needed money for treatment, and I needed this job. But I also needed to stop whatever was killing people, even if it meant believing in monsters. 3 days later, it killed again. Tommy Clearwater worked maintenance at the park. Good kid, 22, just married. I found him near the thermal pools, arranged like the others, arms spread, legs straight, surrounded by small stone circles. But this time was different. This time, the killer had carved symbols into Tommy's chest. The same symbols I'd seen in Jake's barn, but deeper, more detailed. They told a story I was starting to understand. Sheriff Hayes arrived as I was taking photos. "This has to stop. Tom, the state police are coming tomorrow." "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth. That something is killing people in my county." And when they asked what kind of something, Hayes was quiet. We both knew how crazy this would sound. That evening, I called a meeting at the ranger station. Besides me and Hayes, Paul came despite his injuries, and I'd asked Billy Crowhorn to join us. The old man sat quietly in the corner while I explained what we knew. "The pattern is clear," I said. 3 kills, all near sacred sites, all arranged the same way, all marked with the same symbols. "You'd think it's some kind of ritual killer?" Hayes asked. "I think it's exactly what Billy said it was." Everyone looked at the old Crow man. He nodded slowly. "The warrior is getting stronger," Billy said. "Each kill feeds him, makes him more solid, more real." "So how do we stop it?" Paul asked. "There's a way," Billy said, "but it's dangerous. The warrior is trapped between worlds, but he can be freed. There's a ritual, very old, very powerful, but someone has to get close enough to perform it." "What kind of ritual?" I asked. Billy reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Sacred herbs, sacred words. The warrior must hear them spoken in the place where he died." "Where did he die?" "Broken Horn Creek, where you found the first kills." I thought about Sarah, about the boys, about the medical bills. I thought about Tommy Clearwater's young wife, now a widow. I thought about Jake Miller, who'd just been trying to protect his cattle. "I'll do it," I said. "Tom, no," Paul said. "You've got a family, which is why I have to do this." The next morning, I prepared for what might be my last patrol. I loaded my rifle with regular bullets. The tranquilizer darts were useless. I put Billy's pouch in my pocket, along with the words he'd taught me. Crow words, old words, words that might free a cursed warrior. I drove to Broken Horn Creek alone. The morning was cold, and frost covered the ground. The forest was silent, except for the creek's gentle murmur. I found the tracks easily. They led away from the creek, toward a stand of old pines. But these tracks were different. They weren't changing from bear to human anymore. They were something else entirely, bigger than both, deeper than either. I followed them for maybe half a mile before I realized they were leading me in a circle. The thing was playing with me, drawing me to where it wanted me to go. I stopped in a clearing near the creek. The ground here was different, older somehow, like it remembered things from long ago. Ancient pine trees formed a natural circle, their trunks scarred with old carvings. Crow symbols, the same ones I'd seen on the victims. "I know you're here," I called out. "I know what you want." The forest went completely silent. No wind, no birds, no sound except my own breathing. Then, slowly, it stepped out from behind the trees. It was bigger than before, more solid. The thing that had been part bear, part man was now something else entirely. 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur, but with human hands and human eyes. It wore the bones of its victims around its neck like trophies. "You came back," it said in that grinding voice. "Why? To stop you from killing more people." The creature laughed, a sound like rocks falling. "I don't want to kill, but I must protect the sacred places. Your people take everything, destroy everything. They must learn. There's another way," I said. I reached slowly for the pouch in my pocket. "You don't have to be trapped anymore." The creature's eyes widened. "You know the old words. Billy Crowhorn taught me." Billy. The creature's voice became softer, more human. "He was my friend, long ago, before the curse. He still is your friend. He sent me to help you." The creature stepped closer, and I could see the pain in its eyes. Not the pain of an animal, but the pain of a man who'd been suffering for too long. "I betrayed my people," it said. "I sold sacred land for white man's gold. The elders cursed me, trapped me in this form. I cannot die, cannot live, cannot rest. But you can be freed," I said, "if you let me help you." The creature knelt in the clearing, and suddenly it looked less like a monster and more like a man. A tired, broken man who'd been carrying a terrible burden for too long. "I remember being human," it whispered. "I remember my wife, my children, but the curse makes me forget, makes me angry." I opened the pouch and began to speak the words Billy had taught me. Old crow words, words of release and forgiveness. The creature listened, tears streaming down its face. But as I spoke, the creature began to change again. The human looked faded, replaced by something wild and desperate. "No," it growled. "The curse is too strong. I cannot be freed. I can only make others understand my pain." It lunged at me with those terrible claws. I dove to the side, but the creature was too fast. Its claws raked across my shoulder, and I felt my rifle go flying. I rolled behind a fallen log, blood soaking my shirt. The creature stalked around the log, no longer looking human at all. It was pure rage now, pure hunger. The curse had taken hold again. "You cannot help me," it snarled. "No one can help me. I am trapped forever, and I will make others share my suffering." I pulled out my pistol and fired 3 shots. The bullets hit the creature in the chest, but it barely flinched. It just looked down at the wounds like they were mosquito bites. "Your weapons cannot hurt me," it said. "I am already dead." It grabbed the log I was hiding behind and threw it aside like it was made of paper. Now I was exposed, defenseless, with nowhere to run. The creature knelt beside me, its claws at my throat. "I am sorry," it said, and for a moment its voice was human again. "I do not want to kill you, but the curse demands blood." "Wait," I gasped. "Billy told me something else, about the place where you died." The creature's eyes widened. "Where I died, not here. This is where you were cursed, but you died later, alone, trying to make things right." The creature's grip loosened. I remember. "The cave, above the falls. Show me," I said. "Show me where you really died." The creature stood up, confusion replacing anger. "Why?" "Because that's where the ritual has to be performed, where you can finally be free." For a long moment, the creature just stared at me, then it nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember now. Come." It led me through the forest, moving silently despite its massive size. We climbed steep trails, past waterfalls and thermal springs, until we reached a cave hidden behind a curtain of falling water. Inside the cave was dry and warm, ancient. Paintings covered the walls, buffalo, warriors, sacred symbols. In the center was a circle of stones, and in the center of that circle was a human skeleton. "This is where I came to die," the creature said quietly. "After I realized what I had done, after I gave the gold back and tried to return the land, but it was too late. The curse had already taken hold." I knelt beside the skeleton. It was wearing a necklace of bear claws, and around its wrist was a bracelet of carved bone. Human remains, but somehow I knew this was the real broken horn, the man, not the monster. "This is where you belong," I said, "not trapped between worlds, but at rest with your ancestors." The creature looked at its own skeleton with infinite sadness. I had forgotten. The curse made me forget who I really was. I opened Billy's pouch again and began to speak the words. But this time, the creature didn't fight them. It listened, and as I spoke, it began to change. The fur disappeared. The claws became human hands. The massive frame shrank down to normal size. In moments, the creature was gone, replaced by a middle-aged crowman in traditional clothing. "Thank you," he said in a normal human voice. "I can feel the curse breaking." But even as he spoke, his body was becoming translucent. The ritual was working, but it was taking him away from this world entirely. "Tell my people," he said. "Tell them I am sorry. Tell them I tried to make things right. I will, I promised. And tell them the sacred places must be protected. That's why I was really here. Not to kill, but to protect." The spirit of Broken Horn smiled, and for a moment he looked peaceful. Then he faded away, leaving only the skeleton and the smell of sage in the air. I sat in the cave for a long time, thinking about what I'd seen. Outside, the forest was coming alive again. Birds were singing, and I could hear small animals moving through the brush. The wrongness was gone. But I knew this wasn't over. The sacred places were still threatened. People would still come with bulldozers and development plans. And maybe, somewhere, other guardians were waiting. I gathered up the skeleton and gave it a proper burial in the cave, surrounded by the ancient paintings of his people. Then I made my way back to the world of the living. The official report was simple. Rogue grizzly bear destroyed. No further threat to public safety. The state police bought it, the Park Service bought it, and the newspapers printed it without question. But I knew the truth, and so did Billy Crowhorn. "You did well," the old man said. When I visited him the next evening, "The warrior is at peace now. Will there be others?" Billy was quiet for a long moment. "The land remembers everything. As long as there are sacred places, there will be guardians. Some peaceful, some ... not so much." "What about the people who want to develop those places?" "That's up to people like you now. You've seen the truth. You know what's at stake." I stayed on as a ranger for another 15 years, until I retired. During that time, I made sure the sacred sites were protected. I filed reports, blocked development permits, and guided researchers away from certain areas. People thought I was just a stubborn old ranger who loved nature. They were partly right. Sarah beat the cancer. Thanks to new treatments we could finally afford. Both boys went to college and became good men. Paul recovered from his injuries and became a park superintendent. He never talked about what he'd seen, but I knew he remembered. I never saw another shapeshifter, but I felt them sometimes. A presence in the forest, watching, waiting, protecting the places that needed protection. Now I'm old, and my time is almost up. That's why I'm telling you this story. Someone needs to know what's really out there. Someone needs to understand that some places are sacred, and that the guardians are still watching. Last month, a development company announced plans to build a resort near Broken Horn Creek. They want to put up hotels and golf courses right on top of the burial grounds. The permits are already approved. I've sent letters to the Park Service, to environmental groups, to anyone who might listen. But I'm just one old man, and people don't want to hear about curses and spirits. So I'm telling you, instead, if you're ever in Yellowstone, if you're ever near Broken Horn Creek, remember this story. Respect the sacred places. Listen to the wind in the pines. And if you see tracks that change from bear to human, walk away. Some curses echo through generations, and some guardians never rest. The land remembers everything, and it's still watching. The warrior is at peace now, but the sacred places still need protection. And somewhere in the forest, something is still waiting to provide it. Just remember, not all monsters are evil. Sometimes, they're just trying to protect what's left of the world that came before. End of account. * Thomas Redstone died peacefully in his sleep on March 15, 1995. At the age of 78, construction on the Broken Horn Creek Resort was mysteriously halted after 3 workers were found dead, apparently killed by a large predator. The land was quietly transferred to the Crow Nation as a cultural preservation site. It remains closed to the public. *. My name is Margaret Sinclair, and I need to tell you what really happened in the Great Smoky Mountains in October 1974. The newspapers called it an animal attack. They were wrong. I was 35 then, unmarried, and had spent 13 years as a park ranger. My specialty was youth education, teaching kids about nature, keeping them safe on trails, showing them how beautiful the mountains could be. I loved those children like they were my own. Maybe that was my mistake. The were my home. I knew every trail, every hidden valley, every dangerous cliff where a child might fall. Parents trusted me. Scout leaders called me first when planning camping trips. I had prevented 23 accidents in my career. Broken bones, snake bites, kids getting lost. I was proud of that number. That October was different though. The mist hung lower than usual, thick and grey like dirty wool. The trees seemed to lean in closer to the trails. Even the birds sounded wrong, their calls sharp and nervous. It started with the Boy Scout troop from Knoxville. 12 kids, ages 10 to 14, led by Tom Bradley, a good man who'd brought groups to the park for years. They were camping near Cataract Falls when the boys started talking about wild children watching them from the trees. They were just standing there, said Jimmy Morrison, a freckled kid with gap teeth, real still. When I waved, they ran away super fast. Tom laughed it off, probably just local kids playing in the woods. But I'd grown up in these mountains. Local kids didn't play in the deep forest. Their grandmothers made sure of that, filling their heads with old stories about things that lived in the shadows between the trees. The parents started calling the ranger station. They wanted guarantees their children would be safe. They wanted me to investigate. I packed my usual gear, first aid kit, emergency whistle, compass, and my coat pockets full of pep. Kids always calmed down when he gave them candy. I'd learned that early in my career. The trail to Cataract Falls was familiar as my own backyard. I'd walked it hundreds of times with youth groups, pointing out wildflowers and teaching them to identify bird calls. But that morning, the forest felt different, too quiet. Even my footsteps seemed muffled by the thick mist. I found the first tracks about half a mile from the falls. Child-sized footprints in the mud, but wrong somehow. The toes were too long to spread apart, and there were marks beside them, scratches in the earth like fingernails had dragged, alongside bare feet. Feral children, I told myself. Some poor kids abandoned in the forest, living wild. It happened sometimes. Families fell apart, parents disappeared, and children learned to survive on their own. The human mind could adapt to anything, even living like animals. That's what I told myself as I followed the strange tracks deeper into the woods. The mist grew thicker. My whistle, the one that had called back dozens of lost children over the years, felt heavy in my hand. I'd never had to use it in fear before. That's when I saw the playground, hidden in a small valley behind a wall of rhododendron bushes. Someone had built a playground, but it wasn't made of wood and metal like the ones in town. This was constructed from bones, animal bones, I told myself. Deer ribs formed swings hanging from twisted rope. A skull, too big to be human, please God let it be too big, sat atop a pile of stones like a grotesque throne. Smaller bones were arranged in patterns I didn't understand, circles and spirals that hurt to look at. The silence was complete. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves. Even my breathing seemed too loud in that awful quiet. I pulled out my whistle and blew hard. Nothing, no sound at all. I tried again, pressing my lips tight against the metal, forcing all my breath through it. Silent as a stone. My compass spun wildly, the needle swinging in circles like it was drunk. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath, though it was supposed to be 60 degrees that day. That's when I found the clothes. Children's clothes, t-shirts, jeans, sneakers, torn and bloody, arranged in neat piles around the bone playground. Some were old, faded by weather and time. Others looked fresh, the blood still dark and wet. One pile held a Boy Scout uniform. The name tag read Billy Chen. Billy Chen was in Tom Bradley's troop. He'd been with them just yesterday. I ran then, crashing through the rhododendrons, thorns tearing at my ranger jacket. The valley seemed to stretch longer as I ran, like the forest was growing around me, trapping me in that horrible place. Finally, I broke free and radioed for backup. "This is Margaret. I need another ranger at Cataract Falls. We have missing children." James Morrison answered. He was young, only 2 years on the job, but steady and brave. "On my way, Margaret. What's the situation?" "Just get here fast," I said, because I didn't know how to explain what I'd found. James arrived within an hour, his uniform crisp and his face serious. I led him back toward the valley, but we couldn't find it. The rhododendron wall had shifted, or maybe I'd been turned around by the mist. We searched until dark, calling for Billy Chen and any other children who might be lost. That's when we heard them, children's voices, singing. A nursery, rhyme I remembered from my own childhood. Ring round the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. But the voices were wrong. Too high, too sweet, like wind chimes made of glass. And they seemed to come from everywhere at once, above us in the trees, below us in the valley, beside us in the mist. "Hello," James called. "We're park rangers. If you're lost, we can help you." The singing stopped. Then, in the perfect silence, we heard something moving in the trees above us. Not climbing. Children don't climb straight up tree trunks without using their hands. But that's what this sounded like. Something scurrying up the bark like a squirrel, but bigger. "Did you see that?" James whispered. A pale face peered down at us from the canopy, maybe 40 feet up. A child's face, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark, like holes punched in paper. It watched us for a long moment, then opened its mouth in a smile that showed too many teeth. "We should go," I said. But James was already moving toward the tree, calling up to the child. "Hey there, Art, you hurt? How did you get way up there?" The face disappeared. James circled the tree, looking up, trying to spot the child again. "I'm going to climb up and check," he said. "No." I grabbed his arm. "Something's wrong here. We need to get back to the station." But James was young and brave and sure he could save everyone. He started up the tree, finding handholds in the bark, pulling himself up branch by branch. That's when they started calling to him. Children's voices, coming from different directions now. "Help us," they cried. "We're lost. Please help us." James looked down at me, torn between the child in the tree and the voices calling from the forest. "There's more than one," he said. "James, get down now." But he was already moving, swinging, from branch to branch, following the voices deeper into the canopy. I lost sight of him in the mist and leaves. The voices kept calling. "This way, help us, we're scared." Then James screamed. It wasn't a shout of surprise or even pain. It was pure terror, the sound a person makes when they see something that breaks their mind. The scream went on and on, echoing through the trees, until it cut off suddenly. Then I heard the children laughing, not the healthy laughter of playing children, but something cruel and hungry. It came from all around me, from the trees, from the mist, from the shadows that seemed to move on their own. I ran again, leaving James behind, hating myself for it, but knowing I had to get help. The laughter followed me all the way back to the ranger station. I brought 6 rangers back at dawn. We found James hanging from a tree branch 50 feet up, his body twisted in ways that made no sense. His uniform was shredded, his skin marked with scratches too small to be from any animal I knew. But the worst part was how he was positioned. His arms and legs were arranged like a child's broken doll, carefully placed to look as helpless as possible. Something had taken time to arrange him that way. "What could do this?" asked Ranger Stevens, a tough man who'd served in Korea. His face was green as he looked up at James. "I don't know," I lied. "We brought James down and called the state police." They took one look at the scene and decided it was a bear attack. Bears could climb trees, they said. Bears could be vicious when protecting cubs. I didn't argue. What was I supposed to say? That children with too many teeth had torn him apart. But I knew the truth. Whatever lived in these woods was hunting us, and it was smart enough to make James's death look like an accident. Tom Bradley's scout troop was still missing. We organized search parties, called in dogs, even brought a helicopter. But the forest seemed to swallow every trace of them. That's when I started seeing the children myself. They watched from the trees as we searched, pale faces appearing and disappearing in the canopy. They moved wrong, scurrying up trunks and along branches like insects. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of one standing on a branch that couldn't possibly hold a child's weight, perfectly balanced 40 feet in the air. The dogs were useless. They'd follow a scent trail for a few yards, then stop and whine, backing away from something only they could smell. One hound started howling and wouldn't stop until we took him back to town. By the 3rd day, we'd found 2 more bodies. Tom Bradley was discovered in a tree near the falls, strung up like a grotesque Christmas ornament. His body was drained of blood, his skin white as paper. Like James, he was arranged carefully, positioned to look as pitiful as possible. Scout leader Marcus Webb was found at the bottom of a cliff, but he hadn't fallen. His body was placed there, laid out neat and tidy with his hands folded across his chest. The rocks around him were splattered with blood, but not his blood. Something else had bled there first. The state police started talking about a serial killer, someone who could climb trees and move through the forest without leaving tracks. They brought in profilers and crime scene experts. I knew they were wrong, but I couldn't tell them what I'd really seen. Who would believe me? That night, I went back to the forest alone. I had to end this. Whatever was killing people in my mountains, I had to stop it. I'd protected children for 13 years. I wouldn't let some madman or wild animal or whatever. This was keep hurting people. I brought a flashlight, my emergency whistle, and my grandfather's hunting knife. The knife was probably useless, but it made me feel better to have it. The forest was different at night. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching toward me like gnarled fingers. The mist was thicker, turning my flashlight beam into a weak cone of yellow light that barely penetrated the darkness. I was looking for the bone playground again, but the forest kept shifting around me. Paths I'd walked 100 times led to dead ends. Familiar landmarks appeared in the wrong places. Then I heard them singing again. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posi es ... The voices were closer now, all around me. I spun in a circle, trying to spot the singers, but saw only darkness and mist. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. They giggled, and the sound made my skin crawl. There was something wrong with that laughter, something that made every instinct in my body scream danger. Then I saw them. Children stepped out of the mist, forming a circle around me. They looked normal at first glance. Kids between 8 and 12, wearing torn clothes, their faces dirty from living in the woods. But as they moved closer, I could see they weren't right. Their skin was too pale, almost translucent. Their eyes were solid black, like holes in their faces. When they smiled, their teeth were sharp and too numerous, crowding their mouths like broken glass, and they moved wrong. Not walking but gliding, their feet barely touching the ground. They tilted their heads at unnatural angles, studying me, like I was something interesting they'd found. "Are you lost?" asked one. A girl with long blonde hair matted with leaves. Her voice was sweet as honey, but it came from everywhere at once, not just her mouth. "We can help you," said a boy with a scout uniform. Billy Chen, I realized, but not Billy Chen. Something wearing his face. "We know all the trails," said another, and another, their voices overlapping until they became a chorus. "We know all the hiding places. We know all the secret paths." They started walking toward me, their movements perfectly synchronized, like they shared one mind. I backed away, but there were more behind me now. They'd surrounded me without me noticing. "Don't be afraid," they said in unison. "We were afraid once too, but we're not anymore. We're never afraid now." I fumbled for my whistle, but my hands were shaken too badly to find it. The knife felt like a toy in my grip. "Who are you?" I whispered. "We're the lost children," they said, and their voices sounded like wind through dry leaves. "We've been lost for so long, but we're not lost anymore. We're found. We're home." They were close enough to touch now. I could see their skin wasn't just pale, it was see-through in places, showing dark veins underneath. Their breath misted in the cold air, but it smelled like rotting leaves and old bones. "We've been watching you," said the girl who looked like Billy Chen. "You take care of children. You keep them safe. But you couldn't keep us safe, could you?" "I don't know what you mean," I said. "We died in these woods," they said together, lost and scared and calling for help. But nobody came. Nobody found us. So we found each other. The circle tightened. They were almost touching me now, their black eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. "But we're not alone anymore," they whispered, "and soon, you won't be either." The largest of them stepped forward, a boy who might have been 12 when he died. His scout uniform was rotted and torn, but I could still read the patches. Eagle Scout, camping merit badge, first aid. He'd been someone's pride and joy once. "We remember you," he said, his voice like autumn wind. "You came to our school. You taught us about the forest. You said it was safe if we stayed on the trails." My heart stopped. I did remember him. David Kellerman, from a school visit 3 years ago. He'd been so excited about camping, asked a dozen questions about wildlife and survival. His parents had called me later to thank me for inspiring their son, David. I whispered. He tilted his head, and I heard his neck crack. "David got lost," he said. David called for help until his voice gave out. "David died alone and scared in the dark. I looked for you," I said. "When you were reported missing, I searched for weeks." "Not hard enough," said the girl beside him. Sarah Mitchell, I realized. Another child who'd vanished in the park. She'd been missing for 5 years. We were so hungry, she said, so cold, so scared. But the forest taught us new ways to live, new ways to hunt, new ways to feed. More children emerged from the mist, dozens of them, all ages, all wearing the tattered remains of hiking clothes and scout uniforms. Some I recognized from missing person reports. Others had been lost so long their clothes had rotted away entirely. "You failed us," they said in unison. "You promised our parents we'd be safe. You promised we'd come home." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring us back," said David. "Sorry doesn't make us alive again. But you can join us. You can be part of our family." They started moving closer, their movements perfectly coordinated. I could see now that they weren't quite solid. The mist passed through them in places, and their feet left no prints in the soft earth. "You took care of children in life," said Sarah. "You can take care of us in death." "We're still children," said David. "We still need someone to watch over us, someone to keep us safe, someone to help us hunt," added a boy I didn't recognize, grinning with those too many teeth. I finally found my whistle and blew it hard. This time it worked, the sharp sound cutting through the night like a blade. The children flinched, covering their ears, their faces twisting with pain. Silver, I realized. My grandfather's whistle was silver, blessed by a priest decades ago. It actually hurt them. I blew it again, longer this time. The circle wavered, the children stepping back, their forms becoming less solid. "That won't work for long," said David, his voice strained. "Silver hurts, but it won't destroy us. Nothing can destroy us. We're part of the forest now." He was right. Even as I watched, they were solidifying again, adjusting to the whistles. Power, I needed something else. That's when I remembered the lullaby my grandmother used to sing, the one she'd taught me when I was afraid of the dark. "Hush now, little ones, close your eyes. The forest keeps you safe from harm. Rest now, little ones, say good night. Tomorrow brings the morning warm." I started singing, my voice shaky but clear. The children stopped moving, their heads tilted like confused animals. "We remember that song," whispered Sarah. "Our mothers sang it to us," said David. "Before we got lost," added another child. "Before we got scared." I kept singing, adding verses I'd half forgotten, letting the melody carry me back to my own childhood when the world was safe and mothers could protect their children from everything that lived in the dark. The children's forms began to waver, becoming translucent. Some of them started to cry, not the predatory sound I'd heard before, but the genuine tears of frightened children. "We want to go home," sobbed a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8. "We've been lost for so long. We want our mummies." "We want to be warm again," said David, his voice breaking. "We want to not be hungry anymore." "We want to stop hurting people," said Sarah. "But we can't. The forest won't let us. It made us into something else, something hungry." I understood then. These weren't evil creatures. They were children who died in terror and pain, transformed by the forest's dark power into something that reflected their final moments, lost, scared, and desperately seeking the safety they'd never found. "I can't bring you home," I said gently, "but I can remember you. I can make sure people don't forget who you really were." "Will you tell our mothers we're sorry?" asked David. "Will you tell them we tried to be good?" added Sarah. "I will," I promised. The children began to fade, their forms becoming wisps of mist. But before they disappeared entirely, David stepped forward one last time. "Don't bring any more children to the deep forest," he said. "It's hungry. It's always hungry, and we can't fight it forever." Then they were gone, leaving me alone in the silent woods with my flashlight, and my silver whistle, and the memory of children who'd died too young and too afraid. I walked out of the forest that night and never went back to the deep trails. The official report blamed the deaths on a rogue bear, and I didn't correct it. Who would believe the truth? I transferred to a desk job in Gatlinburg, handling paperwork and permits. I told my supervisor I needed a change of pace, that field work was getting too hard on my body. He didn't question it. The nightmares started immediately. Every night, I'd dream of pale children with black eyes and too many teeth, calling for help I couldn't give. I'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, my throat raw from crying out. I couldn't work with children anymore. The sight of a youth group would send me into panic attacks. The sound of children's laughter made my skin crawl. I'd cross the street to avoid school buses. My colleagues thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was, but I knew the truth. I'd failed those children in life, and their transformed spirits had shown me the cost of that failure. I started visiting the families of the missing children, the ones whose bodies we'd never found. I'd sit in their living rooms, looking at school photos and soccer trophies, listening to parents who still hoped their children might come home. I never told them what I'd seen. Instead, I'd say things like the forest can be dangerous, and always stay on marked trails, and some places are better left unexplored. Small warnings that might save other children from the same fate. The Park Service quietly closed several deep forest trails, citing environmental concerns. Camping was restricted to designated areas closer to the ranger stations. They installed emergency phones on the main trails and increased patrols, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The forest was still hungry, still waiting, and somewhere in its depths, the lost children were still lost, still searching for the safety they'd never find. I retired early, at 53, citing health problems. I moved to Florida, as far from the mountains as I could get. But even there, surrounded by palm trees and sunshine, I could still hear them singing sometimes. Ring round the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. They were out there still, I knew, watching from the trees, waiting for the next group of children to wander too far from the safe paths, waiting for the next eager young ranger who thought she could save everyone. I'm 78 now, and I won't live much longer. That's why I'm telling you this story. Not because I want you to believe me, though I hope you will, but because I need you to understand something important. Not all lost children want to be found. Some of them have been changed by their experience, transformed into something that's no longer quite human. They're still children in their hearts, still scared and confused and desperate for help. But they're dangerous now, driven by hungers they can't control. If you ever find yourself in the deep forest, and you hear children's voices calling for help, don't follow them, don't trust them, don't try to save them, because they're not the ones who need saving anymore. You are. My name is Thomas Ashford, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. Most people call me Tom. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana, but lost everything to a bad drought back in '62. That's when I came to Yellowstone. Winter rescue work became my thing. Avalanches, lost hikers, folks who got in over their heads when the snow started falling. I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. It was January 1978, and we were dealing with the worst winter in 50 years. The thoroughfare region, that's the most remote part of Yellowstone, 30 miles from the nearest road, was completely cut off. Snow 8 feet deep, temperatures hitting 40 below, and a blizzard that had been going for 6 days straight. That's when we lost contact with the Kellerman family. They were experienced cross-country skiers from Denver. Father was a doctor, mother was a teacher, 2 kids aged 12 and 14. They'd rented a backcountry cabin for a week-long winter camping trip. These weren't city folks playing around. They knew what they were doing. Or so we thought. The cabin was up at 8,200 feet, accessible only by snowmobile in winter. When their check-in call didn't come through on day 5, we figured it was just radio trouble. Solar storms had been messing with communications all week, but when day 6 passed with nothing, Chief Ranger Williams put together a rescue team. That's where I came in. My team was small but solid. Janet Riverside, our wildlife biologist, knew the area better than anyone. She'd been tracking wolf packs through that region for 3 years. Pete Morrison was the rookie, 22 years old, fresh out of ranger school, eager to prove himself on his first real emergency. Then there was Bill Crow Dog, half-Crow Indian, best tracker in the state. His grandmother had grown up in these mountains back when they were still Crow territory. We loaded up 2 snowmobiles with emergency supplies, medical kit, food for 3 days, emergency shelter, flares, and radio equipment. The GPS was acting up because of the solar storms, but Bill could navigate by landmarks, even in a whiteout. The ride out was brutal. Wind cut right through our gear, and the snow was so thick we could barely see 10 feet ahead. We had to stop every half hour to check our bearings and make sure we weren't getting turned around. The cold was the kind that makes your teeth ache. About halfway to the cabin, we found something that made my stomach drop. It was a hunting camp, or what was left of one. The tent was shredded, but not by wind or animals. The tears came from inside, like someone had gone crazy with a knife. There was blood in the snow, frozen solid, mixed with scraps of sleeping bag and scattered gear. But here's the thing that really bothered me. There were no tracks leading away from the camp. With fresh snow falling, any footprints would have been covered, but there should have been some sign. People don't just disappear. Could be a bear, Janet said, but her voice was shaky. Sometimes they wake up early from hibernation. Bill was kneeling by the tent, studying the damage. No bear did this, he said quietly. And where are the people? Pete was looking pale. Maybe they got picked up by another party. In this weather, I shook my head. We would have heard about it. Bill stood up, brushing snow off his gloves. My grandmother used to tell stories about winters like this. She said, when the cold gets bad enough, when people get hungry enough, things wake up in these mountains. Things that should stay sleeping. What kind of things? Pete asked. Wendigo, Bill said. Hunger spirits. They come when people are starving, when they're desperate enough to. He trailed off, looking at the torn tent. She always said never to travel alone in the deep woods during hard winters. Said some hungers can never be satisfied. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but 16 years in these mountains teaches you to respect the old-timers' wisdom. There's a lot about wilderness that can't be explained by Park Service manuals. Let's keep moving, I said. We've got a family to find. But as we fired up the snowmobiles and headed deeper into the thoroughfare, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no animal tracks, nothing but the sound of wind and engines. Even the ravens were gone, and ravens can survive anything. The temperature was dropping fast, and the snow was getting heavier. We had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, and the Kellerman cabin was still 10 miles away. I'd been doing winter rescues for 16 years, but I'd never felt anything like the cold that was settling into my bones. It wasn't just the weather. It was something else, something that made every instinct I'd developed in the wilderness start screaming warnings. We reached the Kellerman cabin just as the sun was setting. From the outside, everything looked normal. There was smoke coming from the chimney, fresh firewood stacked by the door, and the structure looked solid. But when we called out, nobody answered. "Hello, Park Service," I shouted, pounding on the door. "Mr. Kellerman, we're here to help." Nothing. Janet tried the radio, scanning for their emergency frequency. Static, mixed with what sounded like voices, but too distorted to make out words. "Doors unlocked," Pete said, turning the handle. The inside of the cabin told a different story. Furniture was piled against the windows like barricades. Deep scratches covered the walls, and when I looked closer, I realized they spelled out words. Hungry was carved into the wooden wall above the fireplace, over and over in different handwriting. Some of it looked like a child's scrawl. "Jesus," Janet whispered. "What happened here?" I found Dr. Kellerman's journal on the kitchen table. The first few entries were normal. Excited about their winter vacation. Descriptions of skiing and snowshoeing. Pictures of the kids playing in the snow. But as I read on, the tone changed. Day 4. Strange weather. Temperature dropped faster. Then forecast. Radio not working properly. Kids seem on edge about something. Day 5. Heard voices outside last night. Sounded like Sarah calling for help, but Sarah was sleeping right next to me. Went to check. No one there. Just huge footprints. In the snow. Too big to be human. Day 6. Food running low. Should have packed more. The voices are getting clearer. They know our names. They know things about us. Mary won't stop crying. The kids are acting strange. Always talking about being hungry, even right after eating. Day 7. Something's wrong with Tim. Found him gnawing on a piece of wood this morning. His eyes look different. Yellow, like an animal's. The scratches on the walls, I think he's making them. But some of them are too high for him to reach. The final entry made my blood freeze. Day 8. They're not voices. They're invitations. The hunger is spreading. I can feel it in my stomach, in my bones. The cold makes it worse. Mary tried to. I had to lock her in the bedroom. God help us. Something's coming. Something that's always been hungry. Tom. Bill's voice was tight. You need to see this. He was standing by the back door, which was hanging open. In the snow outside, there were tracks. But these weren't human footprints. They were huge, at least 18 inches long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips, and they were fresh. What animal makes tracks like that? Pete asked. None that I know of, Janet said. She was the wildlife expert, and she looked scared. That's when we heard it. A voice calling from the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. "Help me, please, somebody help me." It was a girl's voice, young, desperate. "One of the Kellerman kids. That's Sarah," Pete said, grabbing his flashlight. "She's alive." "Wait," I said, but he was already headed for the door. "Help me, I'm so cold. Please." The voice was moving, circling the cabin, but as we listened, something was wrong with it. The words were right, but the tone was off. Too steady, too clear for someone who'd been lost in a blizzard for days. Bill grabbed my arm. "Don't go out there, but if it's really her, it's not." His voice was flat, certain. "Listen to it. Really listen." I did. The voice was calling for help, but there was no fear in it, no exhaustion, and it was moving too fast, covering ground no human could cover in deep snow. "Help me, I'm hungry, so hungry." Now there was emotion in the voice, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something that made my skin crawl. Pete was at the door, hand on the handle. "We can't just leave her out there. It's not her," Bill said again. "My grandmother told me about this. They mimic voices to lure people out. They sound like someone you want to help." "That's insane," Janet said, but she wasn't moving toward the door either. The voice was getting closer. Tom Ashford. "I know you're in there. I'm so cold, Tom. Won't you help me?" I felt ice in my veins. Nobody had told this family my name. The rescue hadn't been announced, so how did it know who I was? "Please, Tom. I'm hungry. We're all so hungry." Now there were multiple voices, overlapping, a man's voice, a woman's, 2 children, but they were all saying the same thing, all talking about hunger. Pete's hand was shaking on the door handle. "We have to help them." "No," I said, grabbing his wrist. "We don't." That's when something hit the side of the cabin, hard. The whole structure shook, and we heard wood splintering. Then another impact, and another. Whatever was out there was trying to break in. "Get away from the windows," I ordered. "Bill, help me with this furniture." We reinforced the barricades the Kellermans had already built. The impacts kept coming, rhythmic and powerful. Between each hit, the voices continued calling to us. But now they weren't asking for help. They were describing food. Hot meals, fresh meat, the satisfaction of a full belly. Pete was pressed against the wall, eyes wide. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." "It's happening," Bill said grimly. "The Wendigo, it's here." The attacks stopped suddenly. The voices faded. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind and our own breathing. Then the lights went out. The generator had been running fine when we arrived, but now the cabin was dead silent, except for the crackling fire. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the back room where the generator was housed. The door had been ripped off its hinges, and the machine was destroyed. Not just broken, torn apart like something had attacked it with claws. "Tom," Janet's voice was shaking. "The radio's dead too." I tried my handheld radio, but got nothing but static. The battery indicator showed full power, but the device was completely non-functional. "Both snowmobiles are the same way," Pete reported from the window. "Engines are torn up, batteries drained. We were trapped. No transportation, no communication, and something outside that could mimic human voices and tear apart machinery with its bare hands." "How long until someone comes looking for us?" Pete asked. 3 days, I said. "Maybe 4 if the weather doesn't clear." "We don't have food for 4 days, Janet said. "The Kellermans cleaned out most of the cabin supplies." That's when Pete said something that made my blood freeze. "I'm really hungry, like really hungry." "When did we last eat?" "We'd eaten lunch just 3 hours ago." I'd watched him finish a full sandwich and a bag of chips, but looking at him now, his eyes had a desperate look I'd never seen before. "You just ate," I said carefully. "No, I didn't." His voice was getting agitated. "I haven't eaten since yesterday. I'm starving." Bill was watching him with growing alarm. "Pete, you're sitting next to the wrapper from your sandwich." Pete looked down at the crumpled paper, then back at us with confusion. "That's not a DIDN single quotes T ... He grabbed the wrapper and sniffed it. "This smells like food." Before any of us could stop him, he started eating the paper, just tearing off pieces and chewing them like they were delicious. Janet tried to grab it from him, but he snarled at her. Actually snarled, like an animal protecting its food. "Leave me alone, I'm hungry." His eyes were changing. The whites were turning yellow, and his pupils were dilating. When he opened his mouth, I could see that his teeth looked sharper somehow. "This is how it starts," Bill said quietly. "The hunger. It spreads from person to person. The Wendigo doesn't just hunt, it creates more of itself. That's impossible, Janet said, but she was backing away from Pete. Is it? Bill pointed at the scratches on the walls. Look at the handwriting. It changes as it goes up the wall. Starts normal, gets more and more frantic, more animal-like. Pete was now gnawing on the wooden table leg. His fingernails were longer than they had been an hour ago, and they were turning black. We need to restrain him, I said. No. Pete's voice was distorted, deeper. You can't take my food. I'm so hungry. He lunged at Janet, but Bill was faster. He tackled Pete to the floor, and they struggled while I grabbed rope from the emergency supplies. It took all three of us to tie him up, and the whole time he was screaming about hunger and trying to bite us. Once Pete was secured, we dragged him to the back bedroom and barricaded the door. His screaming continued, but now it was mixed with other sounds, scratching, gnawing, and something that sounded like growling. What do we do? Janet asked. We survive, I said. We keep the fire going, we stay together, and we wait for rescue. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The temperature was dropping fast, and with no generator, our only heat was the fireplace. We had maybe 6 hours of firewood left. That's when we heard Pete's voice from the bedroom. But Pete was tied up in there, and this voice was coming from outside. Tom, Janet, help me. They got Bill. They dragged him outside. I looked around. Bill was standing right next to me. Don't listen to it, he said. That's not Pete anymore. That's the Wendigo using his voice. Tom, please, I'm freezing. I got loose, but something's chasing me. The voice was moving round the cabin, sometimes coming from one window, sometimes another. But it was always Pete's voice, always desperate, always talking about being cold and hungry. How many people has this thing killed? Janet asked. All of them, Bill said. Every person who's gone missing in these mountains during bad winters. It doesn't just kill, it transforms them, makes them part of the hunt. So the Kellerman family are out there right now, waiting for us to make a mistake. As if summoned by his words, new voices joined Pete's. Dr. Kellerman's voice. Dr. Kellerman's voice. This is Dr. Kellerman. We need medical assistance. My family is injured, but alive. Please open the door. Mrs. Kellerman's voice, motherly and concerned. Tom, there are children out here. We can't let them freeze. And the worst one, little Sarah's voice, small and scared. Please, Mr. I'm just a little girl. I'm scared, and I'm cold, and I want to go home. Jesus, Janet whispered. How do we fight something like this? Fire, Bill said. My grandmother said fire was the only thing that could hurt them. But it has to be a lot of fire. I looked at our dwindling pile of firewood, then at the cabin around us. We could burn the cabin down. And then what? We freeze to death in the snow. Better than becoming one of those things. The voices outside were getting more aggressive. They'd stopped asking for help and started demanding we open the door. The tone was changing from human to something else. Something that had never been human. That's when something huge slammed into the front door. The whole cabin shook, and I heard wood splintering. Another impact, and another. The barricade we'd built was starting to give way. It's coming in, Janet said. In the back bedroom, Pete had gone silent. But I could hear something moving around in there, something much bigger than Pete should have been. The window, I said. We need to get out the window. But as we ran to the back of the cabin, we heard glass breaking. Something was coming through the bedroom window. Something that used to be Pete, but was now 9 feet tall and covered in frost. Its eyes were yellow. Its teeth were like icicles, and its fingers had turned into claws. When it spoke, it was still Pete's voice, but distorted and hungry. Tom, it said. I'm so hungry, Tom, and you look delicious. The thing that used to be Pete stood in the doorway, too tall for the frame, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Ice crystals covered its stretched skin, and its breath came out in clouds, of vapor that seemed to freeze the air around it. Pete, Janet whispered, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I'm still Pete, it said, and its voice was exactly the same as before, but I'm also so much more now. I can see everything, Tom. Every animal in these mountains, every person, and they all look like food. Behind it, I could see more shapes moving in the darkness. Tall, thin figures with yellow eyes and too many teeth. The Kellerman family, or what they'd become. How many of you are there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, Tom, we're everywhere. Every person who's ever gone missing in these mountains during a hard winter. We're all here, We're all hungry, and we're all waiting for people like you to get lost in the snow." Bill was slowly reaching for the emergency flare gun in his pack. "The fire will hurt them," he whispered. "Fire," Pete Thing laughed. "A sound like breaking glass. Fire is just light, Tom, and light makes shadows. We love shadows." I saw Bill's hand close around the flare gun. "Now," I shouted. He fired directly at Pete Thing. The flare hit it in the chest and exploded in a burst of red light. The creature shrieked and stumbled backward, clawing at the burning phosphorus. But instead of falling down, it just got angrier. "That hurt," it said, its voice now layered with other voices. "That really hurt. Now I'm going to hurt you back." It lunged forward, but Bill was already loading another flare. This one caught it in the face, and for a moment the creature's features melted and reformed. I saw Pete's face, then then something else entirely. "It's not just one thing," I realized. "It's all of them. They're connected somehow." "The Wendigo isn't a creature," Bill said, firing another flare at the shapes crowding in the doorway. "It's a curse. It spreads from person to person, but they're all part of the same hunger." Janet was throwing firewood at the advancing creatures. "How do we break a curse?" "My grandmother never told me that part," Bill admitted. The creatures were backing away from the fire, but they weren't leaving. They were regrouping, planning something, and we were running out of flares. "The whole cabin," I said. "We burned the whole cabin down." "Tom, no," Janet said. "We'll freeze to death. Look at them." I pointed at the creatures. "They're not going to let us leave anyway. At least this way, we have a chance." I started pouring lamp oil on the walls, the furniture, everything I could reach. The creatures watched but didn't interfere. They knew we were trapped. "You can't run forever," Pete Thing said. "The cold will get you. The hunger will get you. And then you'll be with us." "Maybe," I said, striking a match, "but not today." I threw the match onto the oil-soaked floor. Fire spread across the cabin in seconds, and the creatures outside started screaming. Not human screams, something else, something that sounded like wind through empty spaces. The heat was incredible, but it felt good after hours of bitter cold. For the first time since entering the thoroughfare, I felt warm. "There," Janet pointed through the flames. "The supply cache, 2 miles north." We ran through the back door as the cabin turned into an inferno behind us. The creatures were retreating from the fire, but they weren't gone. They were following us, staying just outside the circle of light. The snow was waist deep and the temperature was dropping fast. Without the cabin's shelter, we had maybe an hour before hypothermia set in. The supply cache was our only hope. "They're hurting us," Bill said, breathing hard, pushing us away from the fire. He was right. Every time we tried to change direction, the creatures would appear, blocking our path. They wanted us to exhaust ourselves in the deep snow, to get far enough from the fire that we'd be helpless. There, I saw the small emergency shelter ahead. The cache. We stumbled through the snow, the creatures keeping pace, but not attacking. They knew we were getting weaker with every step. The cache was a small wooden building, barely big enough for 3 people. Inside were emergency supplies, food, medicine, radio equipment, and most importantly, a small heating unit. But as we reached for the door, I realized our mistake. The creatures weren't just following us. They were driving us into a trap. The cache was surrounded by them, dozens of tall, thin figures with yellow eyes. "Well," I said, looking around, at the ring of creatures, "I guess this is it." "Tom," Janet said quietly, "I'm starting to feel it. The hunger, it's getting stronger." Her eyes were beginning to change, taking on a yellow tint. The curse was spreading, just like Bill had said. "Fight it," I told her. "Don't let it win." But I could feel it too. A gnawing emptiness that had nothing to do with food. A need that grew stronger with every breath of the freezing air. The creatures were closing in, and we had nowhere left to run. That's when I heard it, the sound of a helicopter in the distance. The helicopter found us 3 hours later. By then, Janet had collapsed from hypothermia, and I wasn't much better. The creatures had vanished at the first sound of the rotors, melting back into the forest like shadows. The rescue team said we were lucky to be alive. They attributed our survival to the burning cabin. The smoke had guided them to our location. They found Janet and me unconscious in the snow, barely breathing, our core temperatures dangerously low. Bill was never found. The official report said he must have fallen through ice while trying to reach the cache. His body was never recovered. They also never found Pete Morrison. The report listed him as missing, presumed dead, victim of the extreme weather conditions. The destroyed cabin was attributed to an accident, a gas leak, or overheated stove. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from frostbite and hypothermia. Lost 3 toes and 2 fingers, but I was alive. The doctors said I was lucky. A few more hours and I would have been gone. Janet recovered faster than I did, physically, but she quit the park service as soon as she was released. Last I heard, she moved to Florida and won't even go camping anymore. I tried to tell the investigators what really happened, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Hypothermia can cause hallucinations, they said. Extreme stress can make people see things that aren't there. The official report mentioned nothing about creatures or curses. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. They transferred me to Saguaro National Park in Arizona at my request. Desert heat, no snow, no long winter nights. I thought I was safe there, but I was wrong. The hunger followed me, not the physical transformation that requires the cold, but the awareness of it. I can feel them sometimes, on cold nights, even in the desert. I can hear their voices on the wind, calling to me, telling me about the feast that's waiting in the mountains. Some nights I dream about snow and wake up starving, no matter how much I've eaten. 3 months after the rescue, Bill's grandmother found me. She was 93 years old, but she traveled all the way from Montana to Arizona to see me. She brought me a pouch of herbs and a handful of silver bullets. The Wendigo marks those who escape. She told me, you'll always be connected to it now, but these will help if you ever have to go back. I'm never going back, I said. She smiled sadly. The mountains call to men like you, and it's still hungry. She was right. Every winter, I get reports from other rangers about missing persons in the northern parks. Experienced hikers who vanish, without a trace. Families who disappear from remote cabins. The patterns are always the same. Extreme cold, deep snow, and no bodies ever found. I keep a file of these reports, cross-referencing them with weather patterns and lunar cycles. The activity follows a pattern, peaking every 7 years during the hardest winters. The next peak is due in 1985. I've tried to warn other rangers, but they think I'm still suffering from trauma. Maybe I am. Maybe the whole thing was just a hallucination brought on by hypothermia and stress. But I keep the silver bullets in my desk drawer, and I never go anywhere without a lighter and emergency flares, because I know the truth that the Park Service won't acknowledge. There are things in those mountains that should never be hungry, and every winter, when the snow gets deep enough and the cold gets bad enough, they wake up. The Thoroughfare region is still closed to winter camping. Officially, it's due to avalanche danger. But I know the real reason. Some places are too dangerous for people to visit, no matter how experienced they think they are. If you're reading this, and you're planning a winter trip to the backcountry, remember what I learned that terrible February. Trust your instincts, carry fire, and never travel alone in the deep wilderness. Some hungers can never be satisfied, and some winters never end. The mountains are still calling to me. Even here in the desert, I can hear them, and someday, I know I'll have to answer. But when that day comes, I'll be ready. The Wendigo, patient, but so am I, and I have 16 years of experience keeping people safe in the wilderness. Even if it kills me, I won't let another family disappear into that hungry darkness. The war between man and winter isn't over. It's just waiting for the next blizzard. My name is Maria Santos, and I need to tell you what really happened in Redwood National Park during the summer of 1985. People think they know the story. They've heard about the Bigfoot killings on the news, but they don't know the truth. They don't know why it happened, or what we lost when it was over. I was 29 then, 8 years into my job as a park ranger. I'd joined the service right after college, where I'd studied people and how they connect with wild places. The redwoods called to me. These trees were older than Christ, taller than buildings, and they held secrets I wanted to understand. That summer started like any other. I'd wake up at dawn in my cabin, make coffee, and drive the winding roads to the tall trees grove. This was the heart of the park, home to the world's tallest trees, some over 2,000 years old. The Yurok people considered this place sacred, and I understood why. When you stood among those giants, you felt something ancient watching you. My partner David and I had worked together for 3 years. He was all business, radio checks, incident reports, keeping tourists on the marked trails. I was the one who talked to visitors about Leave No Trace, who explained why we couldn't let everyone trample through the old growth. David thought I was too soft, too willing to listen to the tribal stories about forest spirits. The drought that year was the worst anyone could remember. Trees that had survived for centuries were dying. Their needles turned brown, their bark cracked open like wounds. The whole forest felt sick, like it was holding its breath. Joseph Matz was our cultural consultant, an elder from the Yurok nation, who helped us understand the history of these lands. He was in his 70s, with hands like tree bark and eyes that saw too much. Joseph had been warning us all summer that something was wrong. The balance is broken, he'd say. The protectors are waking up. I thought he was talking about environmental protection laws, maybe court cases against the logging companies. I didn't understand what he really meant. On July 15th, I was doing my morning patrol when I got the radio call. David's voice was tight, professional, but I could hear something underneath. Fear, maybe, or confusion. "Maria, I need you at Grid. Reference 7G. We've got a situation." Grid 7G was deep in the restricted area, where only researchers with special permits could go. It was a place where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight, where the silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. I found David standing beside the crime scene tape, his face pale. Beyond the yellow plastic, I could see shapes on the ground, 3 men in hard hats and work clothes. Scattered around the base of a massive redwood like broken toys. "Illegal survey crew," David said. "Found them this morning. No ID. But they had GPS equipment and core samples." I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The bodies were arranged in a pattern, all facing east toward the sacred mountain. Their equipment was smashed, scattered, but their bodies, there were no bullet holes, no knife wounds, just massive trauma, like they'd been hit by a truck. "What killed them?" I asked. David shook his head. "That's what we need to figure out. But Maria," he pointed to the soft earth around the crime scene. "Look at this." The footprints were impossible. 18 inches long, with clear toe marks and what looked like an opposable thumb. They were pressed deep into the ground, deeper than any human could make. And they were everywhere, circling the bodies like a predator marking territory. "Has to be a hoax," David said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. I knelt beside one of the prints, studying the detail. The pressure patterns were wrong for a fake. The depth was consistent with something incredibly heavy, and the spacing between prints suggested a stride length of nearly 8 feet. "David," I said slowly, "what if it's not a hoax?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "Come on, Maria, you don't believe in that Bigfoot stuff." But standing there in the shadow of those ancient trees, looking at evidence that couldn't be explained, I was starting to believe in something. Joseph arrived an hour later, summoned by the tribal council when they heard about the deaths. He took one look at the scene and his face went stone cold. "You should not have brought me here," he said. "This is bad. Very bad." "Joseph, do you know what did this?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time, studying the footprints, the positioning of the bodies, the damaged trees around us. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some boundaries should never be crossed. The forest has guardians, and they are waking up." The FBI arrived 2 days later. Agent Carol Fisher was a thin woman with sharp eyes and the kind of intensity that made you uncomfortable. She'd been investigating corporate espionage, she said, and these dead men were part of a bigger picture. They worked for Northwoods Timber, she explained as we walked through the crime scene. The company's been trying to challenge park boundaries for months. These guys were stealing core samples, mapping old growth stands that aren't supposed to exist on any survey. "So this is about money," David said. "Logging rights. Big money," Fisher confirmed. "If they could prove the park boundaries were drawn wrong, they could claim salvage rights to millions of dollars worth of timber. But that didn't explain the footprints. It didn't explain how 3 grown men had died without a single defensive wound, or why their bodies had been arranged like an offering to the trees." The second incident happened 3 days later. A Northwoods bulldozer operator named Jim Peterson was found dead in his machine, 20 miles from the grove. The bulldozer had been crushed like a tin can, its steel sides folded inward with impossible force. Peterson's body was missing, but the footprints were there again, dozens of them, circling the wreckage. I was first on scene this time. The smell hit me before I saw the damage, not death, but something wild and musky, like wet fur and old earth. The bulldozer sat in a small clearing, its yellow paint bright against the green forest. But the machine was wrong, twisted, like giant hands had squeezed it until it broke. Jesus, David breathed, coming up behind me. What could do this? I walked around the wreckage, trying to understand the physics of it. The dozer weighed 12 tons. The hydraulic systems had been ripped apart. The engine block cracked down the middle. No animal could do this. No human, either. The radio crackled. "Maria, you there? Here. Dispatch. Joseph Matz is asking for you. Says it's urgent." I found Joseph at the Tribal Cultural Center, sitting in a circle of elders I didn't recognize. They were speaking in Yurok, their voices low and serious. When Joseph saw me, he stood and walked outside. "This has to stop," he said. "Your people, they don't understand what they're doing. Joseph, what are we dealing with here? The footprints, the strength required to crush that bulldozer, ... Double quotes, my grandmother called them stick Indians," he said. "Forest guardians. They've protected these groves for thousands of years. Usually, they stay hidden. But when their territory is threatened ... He shook his head. "They become something else. You're talking about Sasquatch. I'm talking about the last of an ancient people. They're not monsters, Maria. They're parents protecting their children, but they're running out of places to hide." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the crushed bulldozer, about the impossible strength it would take to fold steel like paper. I thought about the survey crew, arranged around that ancient tree like they were part of some ceremony. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and drove back to the grove. I told myself I was just doing a security check, making sure no more illegal crews were operating in the restricted area. But really, I needed to see the place again, to try to understand what was happening. The forest was different at night. The darkness between the trees was absolute, and every sound seemed amplified. I parked at the trailhead and walked in with just a flashlight, following the path I'd walked hundreds of times during the day. I was maybe half a mile in when I heard it, a sound like whales singing, but deeper, resonating through the trees like a voice from the earth itself. I stopped, listening, trying to locate the source. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it was coming from everywhere at once. My radio died, just went silent, like someone had pulled the battery. My flashlight flickered and dimmed. In the growing darkness, I could smell that wild musk again, stronger now, surrounding me. Something was watching me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence like a pressure in the air. It was huge, bigger than any animal I'd ever encountered, and it was intelligent. I could sense its thoughts, its confusion about why I was here, its decision about whether I was a threat. Very slowly, I set my dead flashlight on the ground and raised my hands. "I'm not here to hurt anything," I said to the darkness. "I'm here to protect this place." The presence moved closer. I could hear branches rustling, but no footsteps. It was like the forest itself was shifting around me. The whale song came again, softer now, almost questioning. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. My radio crackled, back to life, and my flashlight flicked on. I was alone in the forest, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been there. Something that could have killed me as easily as breathing. Instead, it had let me go. When I got back to the station, David was waiting with news that made my blood run cold. A third crew had been found, chainsaw operators working illegally in the grove. This time, there were witnesses. Campers in the area reported seeing a giant apeman emerge from the trees and kill one of the workers in broad daylight. "It's going to be a media circus," David said. "FBI's already getting calls from newspapers. This Bigfoot thing is going national." I thought about my encounter in the forest, about the intelligence I'd sensed in that presence. This wasn't some mindless monster. It was something trying to protect its home, and we were about to turn it into a freak show. "We need to find Joseph," I said. "We need to understand what we're really dealing with." But as I said it, I already knew it was too late. By morning, the news vans would arrive, followed by cryptid hunters and thrill-seekers. The forest would be invaded by people who saw the creature as a prize to be captured, a mystery to be solved. The guardian of the grove wouldn't stay hidden much longer, and when it finally revealed itself, I had a feeling the killing would get much worse. By the end of the week, Redwood National Park looked like a war zone. News vans lined the access roads. Satellite dishes pointed at the sky like prayers to angry gods. Cryptid hunters tramped through the forest with cameras and tranquilizer guns, leaving trash and broken branches in their wake. The creature's response was swift and brutal. The first media casualties came on Thursday. A camera crew from some tabloid TV show had hiked into the restricted area after dark, hoping to film the creature. We found their equipment scattered. Across a quarter-mile radius, cameras smashed, lights twisted into metal sculptures. The crew was alive, but barely. They'd been found 20 feet up in a tree, unconscious and hypothermic, with no memory of how they got there. "It's toying with them," David said, studying the scene. "Whatever this thing is, it's intelligent enough to know the difference between killing and warning." Agent Fisher had brought in specialists, cryptozoologists, animal behaviorists, even a military consultant who refused to give his name. They set up a command post in the visitor center, covering the walls with maps and photos of the footprints. The FBI agent was obsessed with the pattern of attacks, trying to predict where the creature would strike next. "It's protecting a specific territory," she explained, pointing to red pins on the map. "All the incidents happen within a 3-mile radius of the original grove. It's not random violence, it's territorial behavior." But Joseph had a different theory. "I found him that morning sitting by the river, away from the crowds and cameras. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by something heavier than years. It's not just protecting territory," he said. "It's protecting family. The grove is where the young ones are hidden. Every attack brings more people, more noise, more danger. The Guardian is getting desperate." "How do you know this?" Joseph was quiet for a long time. "My family has been watching over this place for 7 generations. We've always known about the forest people. Usually, they stay hidden, and we help keep their secret. But the drought, the logging, the constant pressure, they're running out of places to hide." That night, I had the first dream. I was standing in the grove, but it was different, older, wilder. The trees were even taller, their canopy so thick that stars couldn't penetrate, and I wasn't alone. A family of massive figures moved through the shadows, their eyes reflecting moonlight like amber gems. They were beautiful and terrible, ancient beyond measure. In the dream, I could feel their thoughts, their memories stretching back centuries. I saw them watching as the first humans arrived, saw their gradual retreat as settlements grew into cities. I felt their pain as the forests were cut down, their children forced into smaller and smaller refuges. And I felt their rage, a mother's fury at threats to her young. I woke up screaming. The next morning brought news of the worst attack yet. A group of college students had set up camp in the grove, planning to document the creature for a documentary project. The Guardian had torn through their camp like a hurricane, shredding tents, destroying equipment, and hurling their supplies into the canopy 30 feet above ground. But this time, it had taken one of them. Sarah Chen, a film student from UC Berkeley, had vanished without a trace. Her friends found her sleeping bag empty, her camera missing, and massive handprints pressed into the earth around her tent. They were hysterical, babbling about voices in the trees and eyes watching them from the darkness. "It's escalating," Fisher said during the emergency briefing. "The creature is becoming bolder, more aggressive. We need to consider the possibility that it's turned into a Manita." David and I were assigned to search the grove for Sarah. We went in with full gear, radios, flares, first aid supplies. The forest felt different during the day, somehow more oppressive. The usual sounds, birds, insects, wind in the leaves, were muted, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. We found Sarah's camera first, hanging from a branch 40 feet above the ground. It was undamaged, just placed there like a message. David climbed up to get it while I searched the ground below. The footage showed shaky images of their camp, nervous laughter, and then darkness. But in the audio, you could hear something else. A low humming, almost like singing, getting closer and closer to the microphone. "Maria," David's voice from above was tight with shock. "You need to see this." I looked up to find him pointing deeper into the grove. Following his gaze, I saw them, massive structures woven between the trees, 30 feet above the ground. They looked like nests, but huge, big enough for a family of giants, and in one of them, I could see movement. "Sarah," I called out. "Sarah, can you hear me?" A face appeared at the edge of the nest, pale, terrified, but alive. Sarah Chen was conscious and unharmed, but she was trapped in a structure that would take specialized equipment to reach. "Don't come up here," she called down, her voice shaking. "It's not gone, it's just ... waiting." That's when I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees, too large to be human, too graceful to be any animal I knew. It was watching us, studying us, deciding whether we were threats or protectors. And somehow, looking at that shadow, I knew it was the same presence I'd encountered in the forest that night. Back away slowly, I told David. Don't make any sudden moves. But David was already reaching for his radio, calling for backup. The creature must have understood what that meant, because the shadow moved closer, and I could smell that wild musk again, stronger now, mixed with something else, fear. It was as scared as we were, protecting something precious in those aerial nests. The rescue took 6 hours. We had to bring in specialized climbing equipment, negotiate with the creature through a combination of calm voices and careful movements. Joseph talked to it in Yurok, singing old songs that seemed to ease its agitation. Sarah was lowered down unharmed, but she was never the same. She'd spent 18 hours in that nest, close enough to touch an ancient intelligence that shouldn't exist. It has a family, she told us later, her voice barely above a whisper. Babies, they're so beautiful, Maria, and they're dying. The drought was killing the oldest trees, the ones that held the nests. The creature's children were running out of places to hide, and every day brought new threats. Photographers, hunters, scientists who wanted to study them like specimens. The Guardian was fighting a war it couldn't win, protecting a family that had nowhere left to run. That night, I had the second dream. This time, I was in the nest with Sarah, looking down at the world through ancient eyes. I could see the forest, as it had been centuries ago, stretching unbroken from mountain to sea. I could feel the creature's memories, its understanding of loss and change, and I could feel its decision forming, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The Guardian was done hiding. It was done being careful. If its family was going to die, it would take as many of the invaders with it as possible. When I woke up, I knew we were running out of time. The creature was planning something, and when it happened, a lot of people were going to die. The military arrived on a Tuesday morning, disguised as additional park security. Agent Fisher had called in favors, claiming the situation required specialized containment. I watched black helicopters circle the grove like vultures, dropping soldiers with equipment I didn't recognize. They set up a perimeter around the restricted area, but I knew they weren't there to protect anyone. They want to capture it, Joseph said, his voice heavy with grief. They want to study it, turn it into a weapon. David and I were officially excluded from the operation, but I couldn't just stand by and watch. The dreams had intensified, and I could feel the creature's growing desperation. It knew about the soldiers, could sense their intentions. The Guardian was preparing for war. I found Joseph at the cultural center, gathering items I didn't recognize, carved stones, bundles of sage, a necklace made from what looked like massive teeth. I'm going to try to talk to it, he said. My grandfather made a treaty with the forest people long ago. Maybe I can remind it of that promise. Joseph, those soldiers aren't going to let you just walk into the grove. Then I'll have to go around them. He met my eyes, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Absolute determination. This is my fault, Maria. My family was supposed to protect the secret. We failed, and now the forest people are going to pay the price. I made a decision that would change everything. I'm coming with you. We approached the grove from the north, using deer trails that wouldn't show up on military maps. The forest felt electric, charged with tension like the air before a thunderstorm. My skin prickled with each step, and I could smell that wild musk everywhere, as if the creature had been marking its territory. The military had set up motion, sensors and cameras throughout the restricted area, but Joseph seemed to know exactly where they were. We moved like ghosts through the underbrush, avoiding the electronic eyes that would have brought soldiers running. When we reached the heart of the grove, I understood why the creature had chosen this place to make its stand. The trees here were the oldest, the tallest, their trunks so massive that 10 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. The nests were visible high above, and I could see movement in them, small shapes that had to be the young ones. It's here, Joseph whispered. The shadow detached itself from the trees like darkness coming alive. Standing upright, the creature was at least 12 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur that seemed to shift and change in the dappled light. Its face was almost human, but older, wilder, with eyes that held the weight of centuries. It moved, with impossible grace for something so large, and when it looked at us, I felt the full force of its intelligence. Joseph spoke in Yurok, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ritual. The creature listened, its massive head tilted, and I could almost feel it understanding. Then it responded, not in words, but in that whale song I'd heard before, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the emotion behind them: grief, anger, desperation, and something else. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. Finally, Joseph turned to me. "It wants to know if you're the one from the dreams. The dreams. You've been sharing its thoughts, Maria. That's why you can sense it, why you understand what it's feeling. It's been trying to communicate with you." I looked up at the creature, and suddenly the dreams made sense. The shared memories, the emotions that weren't my own. It had been reaching out, trying to find a human it could trust. I took a step forward, and the creature lowered its massive head until we were eye to eye. The connection was instant and overwhelming. I could see through its eyes, feel its thoughts as if they were my own. The creature showed me its true nature, not a monster, but a parent, a protector, the last guardian of a dying species. It showed me its children, hidden in the nests above, and their fear every time humans came too close. But it also showed me something else. Other places, other forests, where its kind had once lived. They were all gone now, cut down or developed, and this grove was the last refuge. The creature wasn't just protecting its own family, it was protecting the last of its entire species. Through the connection, I felt its decision crystallizing. The soldiers were coming, and there was nowhere left to run. It would fight, and it would die, but it would take as many of the invaders with it as possible. "No," I said out loud. "There has to be another way." The creature's thoughts shifted, and I felt a question forming. Would I help? Would I stand with it against the soldiers who came to cage its children? Before I could answer, the attack began. Soldiers poured into the grove from all directions, their weapons raised, their shouts echoing off the ancient trees. The creature's roar shook the earth, and I felt its fury through our connection like a physical blow. What followed was less a battle than a natural disaster. The creature moved through the soldiers like a force of nature, its strength beyond anything human. It overturned their vehicles, tore apart their equipment, and sent armed men flying like broken dolls. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming. Joseph fell early, struck down by a soldier's rifle, but when he tried to place himself between the creature and the guns, I watched the old man crumple, saw the creature's anguish as it realized its potential ally was gone. The Guardian's fury intensified, and soldiers began to flee, but it wasn't enough. Tranquilizer darts found their mark, and I felt the creature's movements slowing. It was fighting against the drugs, using its connection to the forest itself to stay conscious, but it was losing. The soldiers were closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. That's when I made my choice. I stepped between the creature and the soldiers, spreading my arms wide. "Stop," I shouted. "This isn't what you think." Agent Fisher emerged from behind a tree, her weapon trained on the creature. "Maria, get out of the way. That thing is dangerous." "It's not a thing," I said, feeling the creature's presence behind me like a warm wall. "It's a parent protecting its children, and you're about to destroy the last of its kind." "We're not going to destroy anything. We're going to study it, understand it. You're going to cage it. You're going to separate it from its family and turn it into a weapon." Through our connection, I felt the creature making one final decision. It placed a massive hand on my shoulder, and I understood. If I was truly willing to stand with it, to protect its children, then it would trust me with the most important thing in its world. The hand on my shoulder grew warm, and suddenly I could feel everything the creature's thoughts, its memories, its love for its family. But more than that, I could feel its power, its connection to the forest itself. The trees were listening, the earth was watching, and they were ready to act. The grove erupted. Ancient trees bent like living things, their branches reaching down to pluck weapons from soldiers' hands. The ground itself shifted, creating barriers and obstacles that made the military's advance impossible. And through it all, the creature stood protected, its children safe in their nests above. The soldiers retreated, their mission a failure. But I knew they'd be back, and next time they'd bring more firepower. The creature and I had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The government's official report classified the entire incident as a mass hallucination caused by environmental toxins. The soldiers who survived were transferred to classified assignments, their records sealed. Agent Fisher simply vanished, her FBI personnel file deleted as if she'd never existed. But I knew the truth. The creature had shown me something in those final moments, a way to protect its family that went beyond simply fighting off intruders. The forest itself had awakened, and it was now actively protecting the grove. Motion sensors malfunctioned, cameras showed only empty trees, and anyone who entered the restricted area with hostile intentions found themselves hopelessly lost until they gave up and left. I became the unofficial liaison between the Park Service and the Guardian. My reports emphasized the need for increased environmental protection, citing the unique ecosystem and cultural significance of the grove. I recommended expanded restricted areas, additional security measures, and a complete ban on any commercial development within 50 miles of the site. David transferred to Yellowstone 6 months later. The military operation had broken something in him, and he couldn't look at the forest the same way. His replacement was a young ranger named Mike Santos, who reminded me of myself 8 years earlier, eager, idealistic, and open to possibilities beyond the official handbook. Joseph's family formally adopted me into the Yurok Nation. Recognizing my role as a guardian of sacred sites, they taught me the old ceremonies, the songs that could calm the forest spirits, and the responsibilities that came with protecting secrets older than civilization. The dreams continued, but they were different now. Instead of the creature's memories, I experienced its daily life, watching over its children as they grew, teaching them to move through the forest without disturbing the human world, preparing them for the day when they might need to find new refuges. Through our connection, I learned that this grove wasn't the only sanctuary. There were others, hidden in remote forests around the world, each protected by its own guardian. The creature had been in contact with them all along, part of a network of survivors working to preserve their species in a world that had forgotten they existed. My role became clear over time. I was more than just a park ranger now. I was a bridge between two worlds, helping to maintain the delicate balance that kept both species safe. I identified other rangers who might be trusted with the secret, carefully testing their reactions to stories of unusual wildlife behavior and unexplained phenomena. The grove itself began to change. The dying trees recovered, their needles returning to healthy green. New growth appeared in places where the forest had been thin, and wildlife returned in numbers not seen for decades. The creature's influence was healing the ecosystem, restoring the natural balance that had been disrupted by human interference. 5 years later, I received my first direct communication from another guardian. A ranger in the Olympic Peninsula reported strange incidents involving loggers and missing survey crews. The patterns were familiar: protective behavior, territorial marking, and the systematic targeting of anyone who threatened old-growth forest. I traveled to Washington under the pretense of a training exchange, bringing with me the knowledge I'd gained from my partnership with the Redwood Guardian. The ranger, a Quinault woman named Sarah Hawke, had been having dreams similar to mine. Together, we made contact with the Olympic Guardian and established a new protected zone. The network grew slowly, carefully. Rangers in remote areas began reporting to me, sharing stories of unexplained phenomena and unusual wildlife behavior. I developed protocols for first contact, guidelines for establishing trust, and methods for creating invisible sanctuaries within the national park system. But the most important lesson came from the creature itself. During one of our dream communications, it showed me something I hadn't expected: hope. Its children were growing strong, learning to adapt to the modern world while maintaining their connection to the ancient ways. They were few in number, but they were survivors, and they were learning to trust selected humans who proved themselves worthy of that trust. The last entry in my official ranger log reads, "Some boundaries exist for protection, not restriction. The forest has guardians, and they are teaching us to be guardians too. The contract between species is older than law, stronger than government, and more important than any individual life. Honor it, and the wild places will endure." I retired from active duty in 1995, but I never left the grove. I built a cabin on the edge of the restricted area, close enough to respond if needed, far enough to avoid attracting attention. The creature and I maintain our connection, and I've watched its children grow into guardians themselves. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whale song echoing through the trees. It's a sound of contentment now, not the desperate call of a species facing extinction. The forest people have learned to hide in plain sight, to use human protection laws to shield their sacred places, and to trust in the growing network of rangers who understand the true nature of wilderness preservation. The balance is being restored, one sanctuary at a time, and I am proud to be part of that ancient contract, a guardian helping guardians, a bridge between worlds that must coexist if either is to survive. The grove is safe, the children are growing, and somewhere, in the vast wilderness of North America, other guardians are awakening to protect what remains of the wild world. The secret is spreading, but it's spreading to the right people, those who understand that some things are more important than discovery, more valuable than proof, and more sacred than science. The forest is listening, the trees remember, and the guardians are still watching. My name is Robert Ironcloud, but everyone calls me Bobby. I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 14 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, mountain lions, lost hikers, drug runners, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what happened during the October full moon of 1992. I'm Blackfeet, born and raised on the reservation that borders the park. My grandmother Mary always said I was meant to protect these lands, that it was in my blood. After 4 years as military police, I figured park ranger was close enough. I loved the work tracking smugglers through the backcountry, helping lost tourists, keeping the peace in one of the most beautiful places on earth. The North Fork area was my regular beat. It's about as remote as you can get in the lower 48, dense wilderness that stretches right up to the Canadian border. Perfect for wildlife, perfect for people who don't want to be found. French trappers used to work these valleys back in the 1800s. Some of their old stories still float around the reservation, tales of something they called loup-garou that hunted in the deep woods. October had been strange from the start. The weather turned cold early, with snow flurries that shouldn't have come for another month. The animals were acting weird too. Deer bunched up in herds where they should have been spreading out. Elk moved during the day instead of dawn and dusk. Even the birds seemed nervous, chattering constantly in the trees. I was finishing my patrol on October 15th when the call came in. Border Patrol had found something in the high country, near the Canadian line. "You need to see this, Bobby," the radio crackled. "It's bad, real bad." I drove my pickup as far as the old logging road would take me, then hiked the last 2 miles through thick pine forest. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of coming snow. My breath made little clouds as I climbed toward the coordinates they'd given me. Agent Mike Torres met me at the tree line. He was a good guy, someone I'd worked with before on smuggling cases, but today his face was pale and his hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "3 bodies," he said, without looking at me. "Drug runners, looks like. But Bobby... I've never seen anything like this." The crime scene was in a small clearing, maybe 30 yards across. What was left of 3 men lay scattered across the pine needles, like broken toys. I'd seen bear attacks before, mountain lion kills, but this was different, worse. "Jesus," I whispered, kneeling beside the closest body. The man had been torn apart, but not randomly. There was a pattern to it, like whatever did this knew exactly what it was doing. "Gets worse," Torres said, pointing to the ground. "Look, at the tracks." I followed his finger and felt my blood go cold. Massive paw prints pressed deep into the soft earth, easily twice the size of any wolf track I'd ever seen. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was how they changed. Near the bodies, the tracks were clearly canine, for toes, claws, pad marks, but leading away from the scene, they shifted, became something else, something that walked on 2 legs. "What the hell makes tracks like that?" Torres asked. I didn't answer because I didn't know. But my grandmother's voice echoed in my head. Stories she'd told me as a boy about things that could change their shape. Creatures that were neither fully human nor fully animal. The claw marks on the nearby trees were 8 feet off the ground. Fresh sap still oozed from the gouges, and I could see individual claw marks in the bark. Whatever made them had been powerful enough to rip through wood like it was paper. "Find anything else?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Torres nodded toward a backpack lying nearby. "Drugs. New stuff on the street called wolfsbane, supposed to make you fearless, aggressive. These guys were carrying enough to supply half of Montana." I photographed everything, measured the tracks, bagged evidence, all the normal things you do at a crime scene. But normal didn't apply here. Nothing about this was normal. As the sun started to set, painting the mountains orange and red, I felt eyes watching me from the tree line. I turned, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling stayed with me as we hiked back down to the vehicles. "What do you think did this?" Torres asked as we reached the road. I looked back up at the darkening mountains, where the first stars were starting to appear. Somewhere up there, something was hunting. Something that left tracks like no animal in any textbook. "I don't know," I said, "but we're going to find out." The next morning, I drove to the tribal headquarters to see my grandmother. Mary Ironcloud was 83 years old and sharp as a hunting knife. She knew more about these mountains than anyone alive, and she'd been having dreams, bad dreams, she said as I sat at her kitchen table, about things that shouldn't walk in the daylight. "You found something up there, didn't you?" I described the scene, the tracks, the way the bodies had been arranged. She listened without interrupting, her weathered hands folded on the table. "Show me," she said finally. I pulled out the photos I'd taken, the track casts, the claw marks, the crime scene shots. Her face grew darker with each image. "Skinwalkers," she whispered. "I thought they were all gone." "Grandma, you don't really believe?" "Boy, I was here when the last one was killed. Back in 1954. Your grandfather and 2 other men hunted it for 3 days. It had taken 4 children from the reservation before they cornered it in Devil's Canyon." She stood up and walked to an old chest in the corner, pulling out a leather pouch I'd never seen before. "Silver bullets," she said, placing 6 shells on the table, "blessed by the medicine man, carved with protection symbols. Your grandfather made me promise to keep them safe. Grandma, this is 1992. We don't fight monsters with silver bullets." She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "That thing killed those men for a reason. It's marking territory, getting ready to hunt, and tonight is the full moon." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was thinking like an old woman scared by childhood stories. But I kept seeing those tracks, the way they changed from animal to human and back again. My radio crackled. "Bobby, you there? We got another one." This time it was just across the border in Canada. The Mounties had found a park ranger torn apart near a campground. Same pattern, same impossible tracks, same feeling that something was watching from the shadows. Susan Chang met me at the scene. She was a wildlife biologist, someone I'd worked with on bear problems before. Smart, tough, not easily spooked. But today she was pale and shaky. "I had been studying predator behavior for 15 years, she said. "This isn't natural, Bobby. Look at the bite marks." She pointed to deep puncture wounds in the victim's chest, canine teeth. "But look at the spacing. The jaw that made these would have to be massive. Bigger than any wolf, bigger than any dog breed that exists. Could it be a bear? Wrong tooth pattern. And bears don't arrange their kills like this." She gestured to the way the body had been positioned, almost ceremonially. "This shows intelligence, planning, like it's sending a message." We worked the scene until dark, collecting evidence and taking photographs. As the sun set, the temperature dropped fast. My breath came in white puffs, and ice began forming on the vehicle windows. "We should head back," Susan said. "I don't like being out here after dark." But as we packed up our gear, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A howl, long and mournful, echoing across the valley. Then another, from a different direction, and another. "Wolves?" Susan asked hopefully. I shook my head. I'd heard wolves my whole life. This was different, deeper, more human somehow. The howls continued as we drove back toward the main road, following us through the forest. Sometimes they seemed to come from directly overhead, as if something was running through the treetops. Other times they faded to whispers, only to explode back to full volume right beside the truck. "There," Susan pointed ahead. In the road, I slammed on the brakes. A figure stood in our headlights, maybe 50 yards away. At first glance, it looked like a man in a heavy coat. But as I watched, it began to change. The coat was fur, and the man was something else entirely. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with long arms that ended in claws-like knives. Its face was a nightmare mix of human and wolf, with yellow eyes that reflected our headlights like mirrors. When it opened its mouth, I saw rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. "Drive," Susan whispered. "Drive now." I gunned the engine, and the thing leaped aside with impossible speed. In the mirror, I saw it drop to all fours and begin chasing us. Even doing 60 miles per hour, it kept pace effortlessly, running alongside the truck like it was playing a game. Then it disappeared into the forest, and we were alone with the sound of our own breathing and the truck's engine. "What the hell was that?" Susan asked. I thought about my grandmother's words, about silver bullets and skinwalkers and things that hunted under the full moon. "I don't know," I lied, "but we're going to need help." The next morning brought news that made my stomach turn. 3 more bodies, all found within a 10-mile radius of the first attack. Hikers, campers, anyone caught alone in the backcountry after dark. The pattern was always the same: brutal killing, impossible tracks, and the feeling that something was watching from the forest. I called in every favor I had. The FBI sent a team, the D increased their presence, and even the military showed up under the cover of a drug interdiction operation. But I knew better. They weren't here for drugs. Agent Torres pulled me aside that afternoon. "Bobby, I need to tell you something about that wolfsbane we found. It's not just a street drug. The lab analysis came back weird." "Weird how?" "The chemical structure. It's like nothing they've ever seen. It affects the brain in ways that shouldn't be possible. Makes people stronger, faster, more aggressive. And there's something else." He lowered his voice. The chemist who analyzed it said it reminded him of compounds found in old folklore. Stuff about werewolves and shapeshifters. That night, I sat with my grandmother in her living room, cleaning the silver bullets she'd given me. The metal was soft, easy to work with, and the symbols carved into each one seemed to glow in the lamplight. "Tell me about the last one," I said. "The one Grandpa killed." She was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "It was a man from the reservation. Good man, until he wasn't. Something bit him during a hunting trip, and he started changing. First, just during the full moon, then more often. He couldn't control it." "What made him change?" "Same thing that's happening now. Someone was experimenting, trying to bring back the old ways. They made a drug from plants and animal parts, things that should never be mixed. It worked, but not the way they wanted." My radio crackled. "Bobby, we got a problem. That biologist, Susan Chang, she's missing. Her truck was found abandoned near Devil's Canyon, but there's no sign of her." I grabbed my gear and headed out, but I knew I was too late. The search teams found her 3 hours later, alive but hurt. She'd been attacked while taking samples. Something had come out of the forest and mauled her before she could reach her vehicle at the hospital. She grabbed my arm with bandaged hands. It bit me, Bobby, on the shoulder. I saw its face clearly. It was human, but it wasn't, like it was caught between 2 shapes. "You're going to be okay," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I noticed her eyes. They were different somehow. Brighter, more alert. "No," she whispered. "I can feel it starting. The change, it's like a fever that won't break. And Bobby, ... I'm getting stronger, faster. I can hear conversations from 3 rooms away. The doctor said her wounds were healing impossibly fast. Cuts that should have taken weeks to close were already scabbing over. Her heart rate was elevated, her reflexes were enhanced, and she hadn't slept in 36 hours. "How long do I have?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. According to my grandmother's stories, the change took 3 days. After that, the person was gone forever, replaced by something that wore their face but hunted with an animal's instincts. That night, I got the call I'd been dreading. My younger brother Jake was missing. He'd been working with a group trying to shut down the drug pipeline, and now he was gone. His abandoned truck was found near the same area where we'd discovered the first bodies. "We'll find him," Torres promised, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Nobody who disappeared in those mountains came back human. The search teams found Jake 2 days later, but he wasn't alone. 6 other people were with him, all missing persons from the past week. They'd been turned into something else, something that hunted in a pack with military precision. "They're using the caves," Torres reported, "setting up some kind of base camp. And Bobby ... that. They're not just random attacks anymore. They're coordinated, planned, like they're building an army." I loaded my grandfather's silver bullets into my service weapon and headed for the mountains. The full moon was rising, and I could feel something calling to me from the darkness. Something that wore my brother's face but wasn't my brother anymore. The hunt was about to begin, and I was running out of time to save anyone. The caves were a 3-hour hike into the deepest part of the wilderness. I went alone, against orders, carrying my service weapon loaded with silver bullets and my grandmother's blessing. The October moon was full and bright, turning the snow peaks into a landscape of silver and shadow. I found them in a natural amphitheater, a circular clearing surrounded by high rock walls. Jake stood in the center, but he wasn't Jake anymore. He was bigger, stronger, his face caught between human and something else. Around him, the others moved in perfect coordination, like soldiers following unspoken commands. "Hello, Bobby," Jake said, his voice deeper than I remembered. "I was hoping you'd come." "Jake, it's me, it's your brother. Remember who you were?" He laughed, and the sound echoed off the canyon walls. "I remember everything, but I also remember what I am now, what we all are. We're not the victims here, Bobby, we're the solution. Solution to what? To weakness, to fear, to being hunted by people who think they own these mountains." His eyes glowed yellow in the moonlight. "That drug they made, Wolfsbane, it doesn't just change you. It awakens something that was always there, something our ancestors knew about." Torres stepped out of the shadows, but he wasn't there to help. His face showed the same transformation, the same predatory smile. Surprised, he asked, "I've been infected for weeks, feeding information to the pack. This whole operation was designed to capture us, to turn us into weapons. But we have a better idea." The truth hit me like a physical blow. The D hadn't just been tracking the drug, they'd been testing it, using criminals and missing persons as guinea pigs, creating werewolves for some kind of military program. The government wanted soldiers that couldn't be killed, Jake explained, but they got something they couldn't control. And now we're going to show them what real predators look like. The pack began to close in, 6 transformed humans moving with inhuman grace. I could see the intelligence in their eyes, the retained memories of their human lives, mixed with something ancient and hungry. "You don't have to do this," I said, backing toward the rocks. "You're still human underneath. You can still choose." "We did choose," Jake replied. "We chose to be something better than human." The attack came all at once, coordinated like a military assault. I fired twice, the silver bullets finding their marks. 2 of the pack dropped, their bodies convulsing as the blessed metal burned through their systems. But the others kept coming. Jake reached me first, his claws raking across my chest. I rolled away, firing again. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, and he screamed a sound that was both human and animal. "Silver," he gasped. "You came prepared. Grandma taught me well. We fought among the rocks, brother against brother, human against monster." Jake was stronger and faster, but I had experience and desperation. Each silver bullet that found its mark weakened him, but I was running out of ammunition. Torres came at me from behind, but Susan appeared out of nowhere, tackling him to the ground. She'd been fighting the change for days, but now she let it take her, using her new strength to protect me. "I can hold them off," she shouted, "but not for long. End this, Bobby." I had 1 bullet left. Jake lay wounded at my feet, his form shifting between human and wolf. For a moment, I saw my little brother again, the kid who used to follow me through the forest, who dreamed of being a park ranger like me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and pulled the trigger. The silver bullet took him in the heart, and Jake's eyes cleared for just a moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice completely human again. "Thank you for setting me free." He died in my arms as the sun began to rise over the mountains, the curse broken by an act of love disguised as violence. The official report said it was a drug operation gone wrong. The media reported multiple casualties in a border enforcement action. The truth was buried under layers of classified paperwork and government denials. I spent 3 months in a military hospital, recovering from my injuries and being debriefed by people who never gave me their real names. They wanted to know everything about the werewolves, about the silver bullets, about how the curse could be broken. "We're shutting down the Wolfsbane program," one of them told me. "Too unpredictable, too dangerous." But I knew they were lying. Somewhere in a government lab, scientists were still working on the formula, trying to create the perfect soldier. The idea was too tempting to abandon completely. Susan didn't make it. The change had gone too far, and she chose to end it herself, rather than become something she couldn't control. She left behind research notes that might help future victims, if anyone was brave enough to continue her work. I returned to my job as a park ranger, but everything had changed. I could see things in the forest that others couldn't, hear sounds that normal human ears would miss. The encounter had left its mark on me, just as it had on everyone who survived. The Blackfeet Nation formally appointed me as their liaison for supernatural threats. It sounded ridiculous in the modern world, but the tribal council knew better. They'd seen what happened when the old dangers returned, and they wanted someone prepared for the next time, because there would be a next time. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the animals behaved during certain moon phases, in the dreams that visited me on the coldest nights. The werewolves were gone, but other things moved in the deep places of the world. Things that were older and hungrier than anything human science could create. I keep my grandfather's silver bullets in a special case now, along with others I've made following my grandmother's instructions. The symbols carved into the metal seem to glow sometimes, especially when the moon is full and the forest is too quiet. My grandmother lived to be 91, long enough to see me become the guardian she'd always known I would be. Before she died, she gave me a final gift, a map of sacred sites across the reservation, places where the old protections still held power. The battle never ends, she told me. It just sleeps between generations. But now you know what to watch for. You know how to fight. I've documented 17 supernatural incidents since 1992. Most never made it into official reports. The government doesn't want to acknowledge that some threats can't be handled with conventional weapons or military tactics. But I know they're out there, in the deep forests, in the abandoned places, in the spaces between what we call real and what we call impossible. And when they wake up, when they start hunting again, I'll be ready. My name is Robert Ironcloud, and I guard the thin line between the world of men and the world of monsters. It's not the job I wanted, but it's the job I was born to do. The mountains are quiet tonight, but I know that won't last. It never does. And somewhere out there, under the light of the full moon, something is waiting for its chance to hunt again.